There are some figures in history who are explained in detail, and then there are others who appear briefly, almost quietly, and yet leave behind questions that seem to last far longer than their presence on the page. Melchizedek is one of those figures. I remember the first time I noticed his name. It was so easy to pass over. Just a few lines tucked into a much larger story. But something about it didn't quite settle with me. Because even in those few lines, there was a sense that more was being implied than actually said. In the book of Genesis, he appears suddenly, described as a king of Salem and a priest of the Most High God. There's no introduction, no background, no explanation of where he came from. Just a moment where he meets Abraham, offers bread and wine, and then the narrative moves on. And I remember pausing there, because that kind of silence around a figure isn't accidental. It leaves space to wonder, to interpret, and to return to the passage again later, noticing things that weren't obvious the first time. As I read further, I realized that his story doesn't end there. He's mentioned again, much later, in a completely different context, in the book of Psalms, and then reflected on even more deeply in the epistle to the Hebrews. But even then, the mystery isn't fully resolved. If anything, it deepens. He's described in ways that feel outside the usual patterns, without clear lineage, without a recorded beginning or end. Not because those details didn't exist, but because they aren't included. And that absence becomes part of how he's understood. As I sat with that, I started to notice how different this kind of story feels. It doesn't guide you step by step. It doesn't fill in every gap. Instead, it allows certain parts to remain open, almost inviting you to slow down and sit with them a little longer. So tonight, I want to move through those passages carefully, not trying to solve the mystery, but simply to stay with it, to read what's written, and to notice how much is left unsaid. We'll take it slowly, letting each reference connect in its own time, without forcing it into a single conclusion. You don't need to hold on to every detail. You can let the names and moments pass gently, without trying to fix them in place. And if your thoughts begin to drift, if the story softens at the edges as you listen, that's completely fine. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let your breathing slow and allow everything around you to grow a little quieter. If this kind of quiet, reflective exploration helps you rest, you can stay with me. We'll move through the story of Melchizedek, slowly and without rushing to the end. There is a figure in the ancient texts who appears without warning, does something extraordinary, and then vanishes, leaving behind more questions than answers. I want to take you back to a time before kings had crowns as we know them, before temples had been built, before the great covenant between God and his people had been fully formed. Somewhere in the oldest layers of human memory, written down in words we still read today, this man steps onto the page. He has a name, he has a title, he holds bread and wine, and then he is gone. I find this remarkable, not just because he is mysterious, but because the mystery itself seems to be the point. The ancient writers, who were careful about names and lineage and history, chose to tell us almost nothing about him. So let me sit with you here, in the quiet, and let's look at this figure together. This king, this priest, this man named Melchizedek. The name itself carries weight before we even read a single story about him. In ancient Hebrew, the name breaks into two parts: Malchi, meaning my king, and Tzedek, meaning righteousness. So his very name declares something. My king is righteousness. Or as many scholars render it, king of righteousness. Think about what it meant in the ancient world to carry a name like that. Names were not decorations. They were declarations. They told you something about a person's nature, their purpose, their identity before God and before other people. And here, before we know anything else about this man, his name is already making a claim. He is a king. He is connected to righteousness. Whatever we are about to discover about him, his name has already set the stage. We find him in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. 3 verses. That is all the space the entire Hebrew Bible gives him. 3 verses in a single chapter. The setting is the ancient Near East, a world of city kings and coalition armies, of trade routes and territorial battles. Scholars like E.A. Speiser, who spent his career studying the literary structure of Genesis, noted that chapter 14 has an unusually archaic quality to it. The language, the names, the political structures all suggest we are reading something very old, possibly one of the most ancient literary units in the entire Pentateuch. I mention this not to overwhelm you with scholarship, but because I want you to feel the age of this text. When the writer set down these words about Melchizedek, they were recording something that already felt ancient even to them. Now, the title given to Melchizedek in those 3 verses is as striking as his name. Genesis chapter 14 verse 18 tells us he was the king of Salem, and here is where it gets truly significant, a priest of God Most High. In the Hebrew, that phrase is Kohen Lel Elyon. What makes this so striking is the word Kohen, priest. Melchizedek is the very first person in all of Scripture to be called a priest. Not a prophet, not a judge, not a warrior, a priest. Before Aaron, before the Levites, before the whole elaborate system of Israelite priesthood was even imagined, this man held that title. He held it not as an Israelite, not as a descendant of Abraham, but as a Canaanite king in the hill country of the ancient Near East. I've always found it remarkable that the first priest named in the Bible belongs to no recognized Israelite lineage whatsoever. The city he rules, Salem, carries its own significance. For most of Jewish and Christian history, Salem has been understood as the ancient name for Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in his work Antiquities of the Jews, called Melchizedek the founder of Jerusalem and identified Salem with that city directly. The Hebrew root of Salem, shalom, means peace. So here we have a king of righteousness, ruling over a city whose name means peace. I don't think the ancient writers placed those 2 details next to each other by accident. There is a kind of poetry in it, a deliberate pairing, righteousness and peace, united in one man, in one place. And yet, if we are being careful, we should note that Genesis itself does not explicitly name Salem as Jerusalem. That identification, while ancient and widely held, is traditional rather than something stated outright in the text. Here is what the text does tell us plainly. When Abram, this is before God changed his name to Abraham, returned from battle, Melchizedek came out to meet him. He brought bread and wine. He blessed Abram with these words, recorded in Genesis 14, verse 19. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And then in verse 20, he added a second blessing, this one directed upward rather than toward Abram. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. These are the actual words the text preserves. Read them slowly and you feel their weight. They are not casual words. They are priestly words, formal and deliberate. spoken by someone who clearly understood his role as a mediator between the human and the divine. What happened next is brief but deeply significant. Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. In the Hebrew, Maser Mikol, a tithe of all. Now, I want to be honest with you about something the ancient scholars debated here. The Hebrew text is slightly ambiguous at this point. It does not spell out with perfect grammatical clarity who gave the tithe to whom. Most scholars reading the original Hebrew conclude that Abram gave the tithe to Melchizedek, and the New Testament book of Hebrews will later build a significant theological argument on exactly that reading. But the ambiguity is worth naming, because good reading of ancient texts means holding those small uncertainties with honesty. What we can say with confidence is that something was exchanged, a blessing given, a tithe offered. And in that exchange, a relationship of honor was established between these two extraordinary figures. What strikes me most when I step back from the details is the silence that surrounds this entire encounter. The writer of Genesis gives us no introduction to Melchizedek before this moment, and no farewell after it. We are not told his father's name. We are not told his mother's name. We are not given his tribe or his lineage or the story of how he came to rule Salem. We are not told when he was born, and we are certainly not told when he died. In a book, in a culture deeply concerned with genealogy and ancestry, that silence is deafening. Later, the author of the letter to the Hebrews will make much of this silence, reading it as a deliberate feature of the text rather than an accident. But even if we set aside that later interpretation for now, and just read Genesis on its own terms, the silence is unmistakable. The ancient writer knew what they were doing when they chose to say so little. As we begin to understand who Melchizedek is, we should hold two things at once. The first is what the text actually says. A king of Salem, a priest of El Elyon, a man who blessed and was honored. The second is the tradition of interpretation that has surrounded him ever since, growing richer and stranger and more elaborate with every century. Both of these things are real. Both of them matter. The biblical text is a foundation, and what generations of readers have built on that foundation tells us something profound about why this three-verse figure captured the human imagination so powerfully. I find it genuinely moving that a man mentioned so briefly could generate so much thought, so much debate, so much wonder across 3,000 years of human history. So let us settle here, gently, with this opening picture in our minds. A man named King of Righteousness, a city named Peace, bread and wine in the firelight, a blessing spoken over a weary warrior returning from battle, and a silence where a birth story and a death story should be. These are the raw materials the ancient writers left for us, and they are more than enough to build upon. In the chapter that follows, we will step back even further and look at the world that surrounded this encounter. The war that brought Abram to this moment, the 9 kings, the captives, and the strange convergence of events that made the meeting with Melchizedek possible at all. But for now, let this image rest quietly in your mind. A king and a priest, stepping out from the ancient city of peace, to meet a man who would become the father of nations. Before Melchizedek could step forward with bread and wine, a war had to be fought. I want to take you into the world of Genesis chapter 14, not to overwhelm you with names and battles, but because the setting of this encounter matters deeply. Understanding where Abram was coming from, what he had just endured, and who had gathered on those ancient fields of conflict gives the meeting with Melchizedek its true weight. Think of it this way. You don't fully appreciate the quiet of an evening fire until you understand how long someone has been out in the cold. Abram had been out in something far harder than cold. He had been in the middle of the ancient Near East's first recorded coalition war, and Genesis chapter 14 opens the door to that world with startling directness, naming names, listing alliances, and placing us right in the heart of it. The chapter opens with a list that would have felt very real to its ancient readers. 9 kings, 2 coalitions, 4 kings on one side, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam, 5 on the other. These were not simply tribal chieftains squabbling over water rights. These were rulers of city-states in a world where political power was measured in territory, tribute, and military strength. Scholars like E.A. Spicer, who wrote the foundational Anchor Bible commentary on Genesis, recognized that the political structures described in Genesis 14 reflect genuine Bronze Age dynamics, the kind of alliance systems and military campaigns that ancient Near Eastern records do document, even if this specific event has not been confirmed in extra-biblical sources. I mention this carefully because honesty about what we know and what we don't is important. We cannot point to an archaeological tablet that names Chedorlaomer and confirms this precise battle. But the world it describes is not invented. The 5 rebelling kings had served the Chedorlaomer coalition for 12 years, paying tribute. And in the 13th year, they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his 3 allied kings came back with a vengeance, sweeping through a wide arc of territory before descending on the valley of Siddim, a place the text in Genesis chapter 14, verse 3, identifies with the Salt Sea, which we know today as the Dead Sea region. The battle did not go well for the 5 kings. Their forces fell into the tar pits that dotted that valley, and they fled. Among the things taken in the aftermath of that defeat were captives and goods, and one of those captives was Lot, the nephew of Abram, who had been living in Sodom. That detail, Lot's capture, is what pulls Abram into the story. This is not Abram choosing to enter a geopolitical conflict for ambition or glory. He goes because family has been taken. What Abram does next tells us a great deal about who he was. Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, records that when Abram heard his relative had been taken captive, he called out his trained men, 318 of them, born in his household. Think about that number for a moment. 318 men, trained and ready. Abram was not simply a wandering shepherd with a flock of sheep. He was a man of considerable resources and influence, someone whose household functioned almost like a small principality in the ancient world. He led his force in pursuit, striking the enemy force at night, routing them, and chasing them as far north as Hobah, near Damascus. He recovered everything: the goods, the captives, the people, and specifically Lot. The military operation is described with brevity, but its success is complete. Here is what I find remarkable about the shape of this chapter. The ancient writer includes enormous amounts of detail about the political and military context, the names of kings, the geography of the battle, the years of tribute and rebellion. And yet the theological center of the chapter is not the war at all. All of that detail, all those kings and battles and pursuing armies, exists to bring Abram to a single road on his way back from victory, so that one man can walk out to meet him. The war is the frame. Melchizedek is the picture. I think the ancient storytellers understood exactly what they were doing when they built this elaborate backdrop. They wanted us to feel the scale of what Abram had just done, so that when a king priest appears offering bread and wine, we understand the full meaning of the gesture. Now, I want to be transparent with you about something that scholars genuinely wrestle with in this chapter. The four kings mentioned, Chedorlaomer of Elam, Amraphel of Shinar, Ariosh of Elasar, and Tidal described as king of nations, have not been conclusively identified in extra-biblical historical records. Researchers, including W. F. Albright, the great American archaeologist and biblical scholar, have made attempts to match these names with known ancient Near Eastern rulers, but none of those identifications have achieved scholarly consensus. This does not mean the text is fabricated. It means we are reading an ancient account that may draw on genuinely old sources while being difficult to verify through archaeology alone. It is honest and right to hold that uncertainty, and I think it actually deepens our respect for the text, to read it carefully rather than claiming more certainty than we have. There is also another figure who appears on that road of return, one who often gets overlooked in the excitement over Melchizedek. The king of Sodom comes out to meet Abram in the valley of Shaveh, which Genesis 14, verse 17, calls the king's valley. This meeting and what Abram says to the king of Sodom sets up a fascinating contrast with the Melchizedek encounter. The king of Sodom offers Abram the goods. Take the plunder, just give me back my people. Abram refuses, saying in verse 23 that he will take nothing from the king of Sodom, not even a thread or a sandal strap, so that no one can say the king of Sodom made Abram rich. The contrast is quietly powerful. Abram accepts a blessing and gives a tithe to Melchizedek. Abram refuses any gift from the king of Sodom. The writer is telling us something about whose blessing Abram valued and whose favor he declined. The world of Genesis 14 is a world of raw power. Armies marching, cities falling, captives being taken and recovered. But what the chapter ultimately reveals is that even in a world shaped by military and political force, something else is operating. There is a priest-king in the hill country who serves El Elyon, God Most High. And when the greatest warrior of his day returns from battle, it is to that priest-king that he bows his head and offers a tenth of everything. The ancient writer seems to be telling us, quietly and without announcing it, that the most significant exchange in this chapter is not the one between armies. It is the one between a tired man returning from war and a king who came out to meet him with bread and wine and a blessing. As we step back from the battlefield and look at this whole chapter in its sweep, I want you to notice how carefully the stage has been set. The war has been described. The victory has been secured. The captives have been freed. Abram is on the road home, carrying everything the enemy had taken. He is, in this moment, at the height of his strength. And it is precisely here, at his moment of greatest human achievement, that Melchizedek appears. I think there is something profound in that timing. The encounter is not with a man who is desperate or defeated. It is with a man who has just demonstrated extraordinary courage and capability. And even so, Abram receives the blessing, gives the tithe, and honors the priest. Power bowing before righteousness. Achievement pausing to acknowledge the divine. That is the picture the ancient writer leaves us with. So we have our setting now. The ancient world, the coalition war, the rescue of Lot, the road of return. And we understand why Abram was on that particular road at that particular moment. Everything in Genesis 14 has been moving toward one meeting. In the chapter that follows, we will stand right there on that road and look at those 3 verses in Genesis closely, slowly, carefully. The bread, the wine, the blessing, the tithe. We will examine every word the ancient writer chose to include, and we will listen to what scholars across centuries have said about what those words mean. The encounter itself is waiting for us. And I think when we sit with it properly, we will find it even more remarkable than we expected. I want us to slow down now, really slow down, because we have arrived at the 3 verses, just 3, that would generate more theological writing, more debate, more wonder, and more reverence than almost any other brief passage in the entire Hebrew Bible. Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. I sometimes think of these 3 verses as a still pool in the middle of a fast-moving river. The war is upstream, the confrontation with the king of Sodom is downstream. But right here, right at this moment on the road, everything goes quiet. A man appears. He brings food. He speaks a blessing. And the entire trajectory of biblical theology shifts. Let me walk you through what the ancient text actually says, carefully, word by word, because precision matters here, and because the details the writer chose to include are every bit as meaningful as the ones they chose to leave out. Verse 18 opens with this: "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine." That is the first thing we are told he does. Not that he arrived with an army, not that he came bearing tribute, not that he presented himself with the formality of a diplomatic meeting. He brought food, bread and wine, lechem v'yayin in the Hebrew. To a modern reader, those 2 things might seem like a simple meal, but to an ancient reader in the Near East, the act of offering bread and wine to a returning warrior carried real social and spiritual significance. It was an act of welcome, of honor, of recognition. This was not a casual snack. This was a gesture of profound hospitality from a man of rank, offered to another man he clearly recognized as worthy of that honor. And the fact that it is bread and wine specifically, not meat, not gold, not weapons, matters for how later traditions would interpret this moment. The text continues in verse 18. He was priest of God Most High. That phrase, priest of God Most High, Kohen Lel Elyon, sits in the middle of the verse like a quiet declaration. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first time the Hebrew Bible uses the word Kohen, priest, for any person. And the title attached to God here, El Elyon, God Most High, is one that scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion recognize. El Elyon was a known divine name in Canaanite religious tradition. This creates something theologically interesting. The text is presenting a non-Israelite king from a Canaanite city serving a god identified by a Canaanite divine title. And yet, the writer of Genesis treats this as a genuine encounter with the God who called Abram himself. The scholar Gordon Wenham, in his Word Biblical Commentary on Genesis, notes this overlap and sees in it the ancient writer's way of showing that the one true God was not unknown among the nations, even before the full revelation of the covenant. Now we reach the blessing. This is where I want you to really listen, because the words preserved here are sparse but powerful. Verse 19 records Melchizedek's first blessing spoken over Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. The Hebrew phrase for creator of heaven and earth, Koneh Shamayim Va'aretz, is significant. Some translate Koneh as creator, others as possessor or owner. Either way, the scope of the claim is enormous. The God being invoked here is not a local deity of a particular tribe or city. He is the maker and master of everything that exists. Melchizedek, standing in the ancient hill country with bread and wine in his hands, is calling down the blessing of the God who owns all of creation upon the head of Abram. The blessing is as wide as the sky. Then comes the second blessing in verse 20. and this one looks upward rather than outward. Melchizedek says, "And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." This is a blessing of praise, what theologians sometimes call a doxology. Melchizedek is not just praying for Abram, he is attributing Abram's victory to God. He is saying, in effect, what you did out there on that battlefield was not simply your skill, your courage, or your 318 men. God delivered your enemies to you. There is a priestly instinct at work here that I find genuinely moving. Melchizedek's first thought, after witnessing this extraordinary victory, is not admiration for the victor. It is gratitude toward the divine. He redirects the glory before the moment of celebration has even fully begun. And then, verse 20 closes with a sentence that future centuries would examine endlessly. "And Abram gave him a tenth of everything." A tithe. A tenth of all the recovered goods, all the plunder, everything that Abram had won. Now, I want to be honest with you about something here. In the original Hebrew, there is a slight ambiguity at this point in the text. The grammar does not make it entirely obvious, at first glance, who gave the tithe and who received it. Most careful scholars who work with the Hebrew text conclude that Abram is the one giving, and Melchizedek is the one receiving. And that is certainly how the author of the New Testament letter to the Hebrews understood it, as we will explore in later chapters. But the fact that ancient readers noticed this grammatical texture tells us something. They were reading carefully, and so should we. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. 3 verses, 6 brief actions. Melchizedek brings bread and wine. He is identified as priest of El Elyon. He blesses Abram. He blesses God. Abram gives him a tenth. And then the encounter ends, as quietly as it began. No handshake, no extended dialogue, no origin story revealed, no future mentioned. The ancient writer records this meeting and immediately moves on to the very different exchange with the king of Sodom. If you read quickly, you might almost miss it. But the writers and thinkers and scholars who came after this text for 3,000 years did not miss it. They stopped here on this road with this man and they asked, "Who are you, really? What does this mean? Why here? Why now? Why bread and wine? Why is there no genealogy?" The questions began here and never fully stopped. From a theological standpoint, what this encounter accomplishes in the narrative is remarkable. Klaus Westermann, the great German Old Testament scholar, pointed out in his commentary on Genesis chapters 12 through 36 that this passage functions as a kind of divine ratification of Abram's victory. Melchizedek speaks as God's representative, and his words of blessing are not simply good wishes. They carry priestly authority. When he says God delivered your enemies into your hand, he is interpreting Abram's victory theologically. He is naming what God has done. And Abram's tithe in response is not simply a payment. It is an act of worship, a recognition that this priest has spoken truth, that God Most High deserves the acknowledgement that Melchizedek has just given him. In this brief exchange, Abram is changed from warrior returning home to a man who has been blessed by a priest of the Most High God. Now, I want to address something that will come up in later conversations about this passage, and I think it is worth saying clearly now. In Christian tradition, the bread and wine that Melchizedek brings to Abram have long been read as a foreshadowing of the Eucharist, the communion meal of bread and wine at the heart of Christian worship. Church fathers, going back to Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century, made this connection explicitly. And it is a beautiful connection, one that has enriched Christian worship for nearly 2 millennia. But I want to be clear that this is a typological, interpretive reading. It is what later Christian readers found in the text, not what Genesis itself declares. The text of Genesis 14 presents the bread and wine as an act of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. The deeper layers of meaning that later tradition placed upon that act are real and significant. But they belong to the story of how this text has been read, not to what the text itself says. We have spent this chapter standing very still on an ancient road, watching 3 verses unfold. We have seen bread and wine offered. We have heard 2 blessings spoken. We have watched a tithe change hands. And we have felt the enormous weight that those small, quiet actions carry. The encounter is over. Melchizedek disappears from the narrative of Genesis as suddenly as he arrived. But his name has been spoken. His priesthood has been named. His blessing has been given. And somewhere in the great sweep of sacred history, a thread has been laid down that will not be picked up again for hundreds of years, until a poet writing a royal psalm in Jerusalem will reach back across the centuries and invoke the name of Melchizedek in a single, explosive line that will change everything. That is where we go next. Imagine a silence of several centuries. The encounter on the road is over. The bread and wine have been consumed. Abram goes on to become Abraham, the father of a great nation, and the Melchizedek meeting is recorded in Genesis and preserved, but not elaborated upon, not returned to, not built upon in any of the books that follow. The centuries roll by. The Exodus happens. The law is given at Sinai. The tabernacle is built. A whole system of Levitical priesthood takes shape, with Aaron and his descendants at its center. Kings rise and fall in Israel. And then, at some point during the reign of David, or in his circle, or perhaps in the royal court of Jerusalem, someone sits down and writes a psalm. And in the 4th verse of that psalm, the name Melchizedek is suddenly spoken again after all that silence. It lands like a stone dropped into still water. The psalm is Psalm 110. I want to introduce it to you carefully, because it is a text that has generated more discussion, more scholarly debate, and more theological freight than almost any other single psalm in the entire collection. Peter Craigie, in his scholarly work on the Psalms, describes it as one of the most discussed and most difficult psalms in the Psalter. Mitchell Darhood, in his Anchor Bible commentary, examined its linguistic features in depth. And across the history of both Judaism and Christianity, Psalm 110 has occupied a central place in theological argument. Its opening verse, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet," is, according to New Testament scholars, the single most quoted Old Testament verse in the entire New Testament. It appears in Matthew chapter 22, Mark chapter 12, Acts chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 1, and elsewhere. This is a psalm that biblical writers considered foundational. The superscription of the psalm attributes it to David, a psalm of David, Ledavid Mizmor in the Hebrew. I want to be honest with you here. The question of whether David himself wrote Psalm 110 is actively debated among scholars. Some maintain Davidic authorship. Others argue on linguistic or contextual grounds that it may come from a later period in Israel's history, possibly composed for a royal coronation ceremony in Jerusalem. I am not going to pretend that question is settled, because it genuinely is not. What I can tell you is that this is an ancient royal psalm, likely used in some form at Israelite coronation ceremonies, and that its connection to the Davidic dynasty and to Jerusalem's traditions is very strong. The "My Lord" addressed in verse 1 is almost certainly a Davidic king, and the language surrounding him is royal, elevated, and deeply significant. Now we come to verse 4. And here is where Melchizedek's name appears again, after centuries of silence. The verse reads, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek." Let me read that again, slowly, because every word of it matters. The Lord has sworn. This is not a suggestion, not a hope, not a prediction. This is an oath presented as coming from God himself, and will not change his mind. The Hebrew velo yinachem emphasizes the permanence and irreversibility of what is being declared. You are a priest forever, not temporarily, not until a better system arrives, but forever. And then, in the order of Melchizedek, that phrase, al-divrati Melchizedek, is remarkable. It implies a pattern, a line, a priestly category that predates and transcends the Levitical system. Think about what this means in its original context. By the time this psalm was written, the Levitical priesthood was fully established. Aaron's descendants served at the altar. The tribe of Levi had been set apart for sacred service. The entire sacrificial system depended on priestly lineage. You were a priest because your father was a priest, and his father before him, going back to Aaron himself. That was the rule. That was the order. And here, in the 4th verse of this psalm, a different priestly order is invoked. One that predates Moses, predates Aaron, predates the covenant at Sinai entirely, the order of Melchizedek. The poet is reaching back past the entire Levitical system to a priest king who stood in Salem before Israel was a nation and saying, here is a different kind of priest. Here is a priestly calling that does not depend on genealogy. Here is a priesthood established not by inheritance but by divine oath. The royal psalms of Israel, and Psalm 110 is one of them, were very likely used in the context of coronation ceremonies, scholars believe. When a new king was enthroned in Jerusalem, psalms like this one may have been sung or proclaimed in his honor. In that setting, verse 4 would have carried a specific political and religious meaning. The king of Israel was not just a military and civic ruler. He also held a kind of priestly standing before God, modeled on the ancient pattern of Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem. This made theological sense for the Davidic dynasty, because David himself had acted in priestly ways, offering sacrifices, dancing before the ark, blessing the people. And Jerusalem, David's city, was believed to be built on the very ground where Salem once stood. So the Melchizedek reference was not accidental or exotic. It was a deliberate, rooted claim about the nature of Davidic kingship. Now I want to tell you something about the way this verse traveled through history, because it is one of the most fascinating journeys in all of biblical reception. In the centuries before the time of Jesus, Jewish readers had already developed a strong interest in the messianic possibilities of Psalm 110. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which we will explore in depth in a later chapter, show us that the Qumran community, a Jewish sect living near the Dead Sea, was deeply engaged with texts about a coming heavenly figure linked to Melchizedek. They were reading Psalm 110 in their caves in the desert, thinking about what it meant, imagining what kind of figure could truly embody this divine oath of eternal priesthood. The messianic interpretation of Psalm 110 was alive and active in Jewish thought, well before any Christian writer touched it. When the New Testament writers encountered Jesus of Nazareth, a man from the tribe of Judah, not from the tribe of Levi, which meant he could never be an Aaronic priest under Jewish law, they faced a serious theological question. How could Jesus be a priest? The answer they found was in Psalm 110, verse 4. Not the Levitical line, not Aaron's descendants. The order of Melchizedek, established before the law, confirmed by a divine oath, eternal in its character. The author of the letter to the Hebrews will take this argument and develop it into one of the most sophisticated theological constructions in the entire New Testament. But I find it meaningful that the seed of that argument is here, in this ancient psalm, centuries before Hebrews was written. Someone in the courts of Jerusalem had already glimpsed something in the figure of Melchizedek that pointed beyond the existing order. What I find genuinely moving about Psalm 110 is the force of the oath it contains. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. In a world where kings made promises and broke them, where alliances shifted and covenants were sometimes abandoned, this verse speaks of something immovable, a priestly calling that is permanent, a divine word that cannot be retracted. Whether you read this as referring to a Davidic king, or as the New Testament writers read it, pointing toward Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment, the emotional core of the verse is the same. This priesthood will not fail. It will not expire. It is not conditional on performance or on lineage. It rests on an oath that God himself has sworn. There is something deeply comforting in that. Something solid in a world that offers so little that is solid. So here we stand, with 2 reference points in the Hebrew Bible, 3 verses in Genesis and 1 verse in a psalm, a brief encounter and a royal proclamation, a meeting on a road and a divine oath spoken across centuries. These are the canonical anchors for everything that follows. The next chapter takes us out of the Hebrew Bible entirely and into a world of ancient caves and hidden manuscripts, where a Jewish community in the desert had been thinking about Melchizedek in ways that would shock and surprise even the most careful reader. What they found, or what they imagined, in this mysterious figure goes further than Genesis, further than the Psalm, further than almost anything the biblical writers themselves dared to say. But that is precisely what makes it so fascinating. The story is not done yet. In the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the hills above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Looking into a cave, he threw a stone and heard the sound of pottery breaking. What he found inside that cave, and what was found in the caves nearby over the following years, would turn out to be among the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Dozens of caves, hundreds of manuscripts, thousands of fragments, preserved in the dry desert air for nearly 2,000 years. We call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. And hidden among those fragments, pieced together painstakingly from scraps of deteriorating parchment, was a text that transformed how scholars understand the figure of Melchizedek. When I first read about this discovery, I felt the particular thrill that comes from something ancient suddenly becoming new. A voice from 2 millennia ago saying something no one had heard for all that time. The text I want to tell you about is known to scholars as 11Q Melchizedek, sometimes written 11Q13, referring to Cave 11 at Qumran, where it was found. It is a fragmentary document, meaning that significant portions of it have been lost to time and decay, and what remains has been carefully reconstructed by scholars like Paul Kobelski, who wrote a detailed study of it, and Florentino Garcia Martinez, whose translation work brought the Dead Sea Scrolls to a wider audience. The document is dated by scholars to approximately 100 to 50 years before the Common Era. So roughly, 100 to 50 years before the time of Jesus. This dating is important because it means that what this text says about Melchizedek was already being thought, written, and studied in Jewish communities before any Christian writer ever picked up a pen. What does 11q Melchizedek actually say? Let me describe it to you with the honesty that the fragmentary nature of the text requires. The scroll is a pesha, which means it is a form of ancient biblical commentary in which a text is quoted and then interpreted for a specific community with a specific message about the end of days. The Qumran community loved this kind of writing. They read their scriptures as containing hidden messages about their own time and the coming age of divine judgment. And in this particular pesha, the figure of Melchizedek is placed at the center of an extraordinary cosmic drama. He is not simply a priest-king from the time of Abraham, blessing a weary warrior on a road. He is a heavenly figure, a divine agent who will execute God's judgment in the final Jubilee year. The text draws on passages from the Hebrew Bible and applies them directly to Melchizedek. It quotes from Isaiah chapter 61. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor," and attributes that mission to Melchizedek. It draws on Psalm 82, verse 1. God stands in the divine council. He renders judgment among the gods, and presents Melchizedek as the one standing in that council, rendering judgment. The community at Qumran was building a portrait of Melchizedek that had moved far beyond what Genesis or the Psalms describe. In their vision, he was not merely an ancient priest. He was a cosmic judge, a heavenly warrior, a figure of eschatological power, one who would appear at the end of history to deliver the righteous and defeat the forces of evil. What strikes me most about this text, when I sit with it carefully, is what it reveals about how ancient Jewish readers approached figures like Melchizedek. They did not treat the biblical text as a closed, literal record to be read flatly. They read it as a layered document full of deeper meanings waiting to be unlocked. The silence around Melchizedek in Genesis, the absence of a genealogy, the absence of a birth and death, the absence of any ordinary human framework, did not strike them as a minor literary curiosity. It struck them as a clue. It pointed towards something non-ordinary, something that transcended the normal categories of human life. And the divine oath in Psalm 110 and verse 4, "You are a priest forever," sounded to their ears not like a poetic metaphor, but like a literal statement about an eternal being. The community that preserved and likely wrote these scrolls is widely identified by scholars as the Essenes, a Jewish sect that had withdrawn from mainstream Jerusalem society, settled at a place called Qumran near the Dead Sea, and organized their lives around an intense devotion to scripture, ritual purity, and the expectation of an imminent end of the age. They understood themselves as living in a cosmic battle between forces of light and forces of darkness. And in that worldview, powerful heavenly figures played important roles. The scroll on Melchizedek places him in opposition to a figure called Melchiresha, king of wickedness, who leads the forces of darkness. Melchizedek, king of righteousness, stands against him. The very meaning of his name has been transformed into the title of a cosmic champion. Now I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of material where it is easy to blur important lines. What 11q Melchizedek describes is not what the canonical Hebrew Bible says about Melchizedek. It is a Second Temple Jewish interpretation, creative, visionary, and deeply interesting. But it belongs to the category of what scholars call pseudepigraphal or sectarian literature. The Qumran community was reading their scriptures through the lens of their own experience and expectations, and they produced a Melchizedek who reflected those lenses. When we read this text, we are not reading a continuation of the biblical story. We are reading what one group of ancient Jewish thinkers believed the story meant. That distinction matters, and good scholarship requires us to hold it clearly. What I find genuinely fascinating, though, is the relationship between this text and what comes later. The letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, which we will spend considerable time with in future chapters, makes some of its most significant arguments about Melchizedek on the basis of the same kind of reasoning the Qumran community used. The reasoning from silence, the argument from what Genesis does not say, the emphasis on Melchizedek's priestly character as transcending normal human categories. Scholars debate whether the author of Hebrews knew the Qumran text directly. Most conclude that the two are probably independent developments, drawing on similar interpretive traditions rather than one depending on the other. But the convergence is striking. It tells us that there was a current of thought in Second Temple Judaism that was already moving in a particular direction with regard to this figure. And both the Qumran scribes and the author of Hebrews were swimming in that same current. Think about what it means that this text was copied and preserved in the desert for 2,000 years, hidden in a clay jar in a cave, waiting to be found. The community that hid these scrolls almost certainly did so during a time of great danger, possibly around the time of the Roman destruction of the area in 68 CE. They packed their library into jars and sealed it in the hills, and then they were gone. Their words survived them by nearly 2 millennia, and one of the things they chose to preserve and to think carefully about was Melchizedek. This tells us something about how important this figure was to at least one significant strand of ancient Jewish thought. He was not a minor footnote. He was, for this community, a figure of cosmic importance, someone who stood at the intersection of history and eternity, righteousness and judgment, the human world and the divine. As we leave the caves of Qumran and come back to the surface, I want you to carry with you this picture. The Melchizedek of the Dead Sea. Scrolls is not the only Melchizedek, but he is a real and important one. He shows us that by the time the New Testament was being written, Jewish thinkers had already developed rich and elaborate ideas about who this ancient priest-king was and what he represented. The silence of Genesis had been filled, in one corner of the Jewish world, with heavenly fire. And now, as we move forward into the New Testament itself, we will see another writer take up the same mysterious figure and build something entirely different and entirely new, from the same ancient materials. The letter to the Hebrews is waiting for us, and it has a great deal to say. There is a letter in the New Testament that reads, unlike anything else in the collection. It is dense, carefully argued, and written with a kind of intellectual passion that you can feel even across 2,000 years of translation. We call it the letter to the Hebrews, and I want to invite you into it tonight. Not as a theological textbook, but as what it actually is. A passionate appeal from one human being to a community of people who were struggling, who were tired, who were considering turning back from something they had committed themselves to. Whoever wrote this letter, and we will talk about that mystery shortly, cared deeply about their readers. You can feel it in the urgency of the prose, and right at the heart of their argument, like a key that unlocks an entire theological door, is the name we have been following through caves and ancient roads and royal psalms: Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews picks up that name and holds it up like a lamp in the dark. Before we look at what Hebrews says, let me tell you something about what we do not know. because I think honesty here actually makes the text more interesting, not less. We do not know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. That is not a modern, scholarly skepticism. It is an ancient one. Origen of Alexandria. She's one of the greatest biblical scholars of the early Christian centuries, living around 185 to 254 of the Common Era, said plainly that only God truly knows who wrote this letter. Over the centuries, names have been proposed. The Apostle Paul, a man named Apollos who is described in Acts as eloquent and learned in Scripture, Priscilla who led an early house church, Barnabas, the companion of Paul. None of these attributions has been proven. The letter is, in the end, anonymous. And yet, the theological vision it contains is among the most sophisticated in the entire New Testament canon. The letter was written to a community of Jewish Christians, people who had come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but who were now under real social and perhaps physical pressure to step back from that commitment and return to the practices of traditional Judaism. Think about what that pressure would have felt like. These were people who had grown up with the rhythms of the temple, with the sacred calendar, with the Aaronic priesthood and its sacrifices and its rituals. Those things were beautiful and ancient and connected to the deepest roots of their identity. And now they were being asked to hold all of that alongside a claim that a man from Galilee, who died on a Roman cross, was the fulfillment of everything the temple pointed toward. The pull backward must have been powerful. The author of Hebrews understood that pull, and they responded not with condemnation, but with an intricate, patient argument, built around the question of priesthood. The argument begins in Hebrews chapter 5. The author opens by describing what a high priest does. He is chosen from among human beings, appointed to act on their behalf before God, offering gifts and sacrifices for sins. He deals gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, the text says in verse 2, because he himself is subject to weakness. This is a portrait of the Aaronic high priest drawn with empathy and precision. And then the author pivots. In verse 5, they begin to apply this framework to Jesus, who, they argue, did not appoint himself to the role of high priest. He was appointed by God. And the evidence they offer for that appointment is a direct quotation from Psalm 110. Verse 4, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Those words, which we explored in our last chapter, are here given a specific and revolutionary application. They are applied directly, by name, to Jesus of Nazareth. What I find so striking about the way the author uses this quotation is the care with which they set it up. They know this is a bold claim. They know their readers will feel the weight of it. The suggestion that Jesus holds a priestly office that is in some sense superior to the Aaronic line, the sacred lineage their entire religious life had been organized around. So they do not rush it. They build the foundation first. They establish that Jesus suffered, that he cried out in anguish, that he learned obedience through what he endured. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 through 8. They are not presenting a distant, untouchable figure. They are presenting someone who entered human experience fully, who knows what weakness feels like from the inside. And it is precisely this figure, this suffering, obedient, fully human figure, who is designated by God as a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. That combination is the author's point. Not power alone, but power through suffering. Hebrews 5 verse 10 uses a particular Greek word that rewards attention. It says Jesus was designated by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The word in Greek is prosagorio, which carries the sense of being formally named, officially given a title. The scholar Harold Attridge, in his Hermeneia commentary on Hebrews, she notes that this word was used in Hellenistic contexts for official appointments and recognitions. So the author is saying something very specific. Jesus was not simply associated with Melchizedek's priestly pattern. He was formally given that title by God. The divine appointment is real, official, and permanent. And this is what makes his priesthood different from every other. No human committee named him. No lineage qualified him. No ceremony at the temple installed him. God spoke, and the appointment was made. Then something interesting happens in verse 11. The author of Hebrews stops. They are right in the middle of their Melchizedek argument, and they pause to say, "We have much to say about this, but it is hard to explain because you have become dull of hearing." That phrase has always struck me as one of the most genuinely human moments in the New Testament. You can feel the author's frustration, but also their pastoral care. They are not insulting their readers. They are acknowledging that what they are about to say is genuinely difficult. It requires a maturity of understanding that they feel their readers have not yet fully developed. The teaching about Melchizedek is not simple. It is not a surface-level point. It requires the reader to hold multiple things in mind at once: the Genesis story, the royal psalm, the Levitical system, the nature of covenant, and the significance of divine oaths. The author knows this, and they name it honestly. This moment of honesty in Hebrews 5 is, I think, one of the most underappreciated passages in the whole letter. The author essentially tells their readers, you need to grow before you can fully receive what I am about to give you. They go on in verses 12 through 14 to use the metaphor of solid food versus milk. Infants need milk, but mature people can digest solid food. The teaching about Melchizedek and the eternal priesthood of Jesus is, in their framing, solid food. It is not meant to be swallowed quickly or held lightly. It is meant to be chewed, considered, turned over in the mind and the heart. And I find that a deeply respectful posture. The author is not dumbing down their argument to make it more palatable. They are calling their readers up to a higher level of engagement, trusting that they are capable of getting there. What does all of this mean for us? I'm reading from a much greater distance. I think chapter 5 of Hebrews does something that is easy to miss if we rush toward the more famous theological arguments in chapter 7. It grounds everything that follows in a very human reality. The reality of suffering, of learning, of growing, of being called to something that is hard to understand and harder still to hold on to under pressure. The Melchizedek argument is not abstract theology floating above ordinary life. It is offered to people who are tired and tempted to give up. The author is saying, look at this ancient figure. Look at what God declared about him. Look at how that declaration points to someone who has walked through the same darkness you are walking through. Hold on. There is a priesthood that does not fail. There is a priest who does not leave. And his name, his calling, his nature, all of it connects back to a mysterious king priest who stepped out of Salem with bread and wine in his hands. As we close this chapter, I want you to feel the shape of what the author of Hebrews is building. They have laid a foundation in chapter 5. The priesthood of Jesus, confirmed by divine oath, grounded in Psalm 110, connected to the order of Melchizedek. But they have also told us that the full argument is still coming. They have whetted the appetite and acknowledged the difficulty and called their readers to readiness. In our next chapter, we move into Hebrews 7, 42 verses that represent the most concentrated, the most careful, the most far-reaching theological argument about Melchizedek that any ancient writer ever produced. Everything in chapters 1 through 5 of Hebrews has been preparing for it, and I think when we arrive there, you will find it worth the wait. We have arrived at what I would call the theological summit of the entire Melchizedek story. Hebrews chapter 7, 42 verses. Carefully constructed, logically progressive, theologically ambitious, and built on the back of 3 verses from Genesis and 1 line from a psalm. I want to walk through this chapter with you slowly because it deserves that care. The scholar William Lane, in his word biblical commentary on Hebrews chapters 1 through 8, describes chapter 7 as the heart of the entire letter, the place toward which everything before it has been moving, and from which everything after it flows. Gareth Lee Cockerell, in his NICNT commentary, calls it one of the most carefully argued passages in the New Testament. These are not small claims, and when you read the chapter carefully, you understand why scholars speak of it in those terms. This is someone thinking at full stretch, reaching for something genuinely new, using the oldest materials available. The chapter opens with a summary of the Genesis encounter that we explored together back in chapter 3. The author of Hebrews retells the meeting. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, met Abraham returning from the battle and blessed him. Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Then the author does something that reveals the depth of their reading of the text. They dwell on the name. First, his name means King of Righteousness. They write in verse 2. Then also, King of Salem means King of Peace. The author is reading the Hebrew meaning of Melchizedek's name and the meaning of the city Salem with the attentiveness of someone who understands that names in the ancient world carry theological weight. King of Righteousness, King of Peace. These are not incidental details. They are, in the author's reading, part of what makes Melchizedek a fitting pattern for the kind of priesthood they want to describe. Then we reach verse 3, and this is the verse that has generated more debate, more misreading, and more theological controversy than almost any other single verse in the letter. Let me read it to you. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Those words, without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, have been taken by some readers across history as a literal claim that Melchizedek had no human parents, no birth, no death. Some have concluded from this that he must have been an angel or a divine being, or even the pre-incarnate Christ walking the earth in disguise. I want to be very clear with you about what scholars who have studied this text carefully actually say. The author of Hebrews is making a typological argument. They are pointing to what the text of Genesis does not say about Melchizedek. Genesis records no parents for him, no birth, no death. And in the author's interpretive method, that silence in the text functions as a theological statement about the kind of priesthood Melchizedek represents. The argument is about the text, not a claim about the man's literal supernatural nature. The tithe argument begins in verse 4 and runs through verse 10, and it is one of the most carefully constructed logical arguments in the New Testament. The author asks their readers to consider how great Melchizedek must be. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him 1/10 of the plunder, verse 4 tells us. Now here is where the reasoning gets genuinely creative. Under the Levitical system, Israelites paid tithes to the descendants of Levi, to the priests and Levites, as commanded in the law. But the author points out in verse 5 that the Levites collect tithes from their own people, from their own brothers. Melchizedek, by contrast, collected a tithe from Abraham. And Abraham was not just anyone. Abraham was the one who had received the divine promises, the one through whom all the covenant blessings would flow. For the lesser to be blessed by the greater is the natural order of things, the author says in verse 7. And Abraham, the father of the covenant, received the blessing from Melchizedek. What does that tell us about Melchizedek's standing? The argument then moves to what I find one of its most inventive moments, in verses 9 and 10. The author says that in a sense, and notice they say, in a sense, they are aware this is a bold claim. Levi himself, the father of the entire priestly tribe, paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham, because Levi was, in biological terms, a descendant of Abraham, still in his ancestor's body, as the text puts it in verse 10, at the moment Abraham gave the tithe. This is a form of reasoning that feels foreign to modern readers, but it was a recognized and accepted mode of argument in ancient Jewish interpretation. The point is not biological literalism. The point is that the entire Levitical order, by virtue of descending from Abraham, was present in some sense when Abraham honored Melchizedek. The Levitical priesthood, in the author's framework, has already acknowledged the superiority of the Melchizedek order through its own ancestor on that road outside Salem. Now the author turns to what I consider the structural center of the entire argument, beginning in verse 11. They pose a direct question. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? Think about the force of that question. If the Levitical system was sufficient, if Aaron's priesthood accomplished everything that needed to be accomplished, then why did the Holy Spirit inspire a royal psalmist to declare the coming of a priest in the order of Melchizedek? The existence of Psalm 110, verse 4, is itself evidence, the author argues, that the Levitical system was not the final word. God would not have sworn a new oath if the existing arrangement were adequate. This leads to verse 12, which states something theologically significant and deliberately. For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. This is a striking claim. The author is arguing that priesthood and law are inseparably linked, that the entire Mosaic legal framework was organized around and dependent upon the Aaronic priestly system. A change in priesthood therefore implies a change in the governing covenant structure. I want to handle this carefully because it is a claim that sits at the center of long-standing Jewish-Christian theological difference. The author of Hebrews is making an argument from within a Jewish-Christian framework, speaking to Jewish Christians who know the law deeply. They are not dismissing the law as evil or worthless. They are arguing that it was always pointing towards something it could not itself achieve, and that the oath of Psalm 110 announces the arrival of that something. That is a specific theological position, belonging to a specific tradition, and we should receive it as such. The chapter builds toward its climax in verses 20 through 22, and here the divine oath becomes the final argument. Others became priests without any oath, the author writes, but he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." The contrast is between the Aaronic priests, appointed through lineage and law, and Jesus, appointed through a sworn and irrevocable divine declaration. The author then draws the conclusion in verse 22. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. Kreton diatheka in the Greek, a better covenant. Not better in the sense that the old one was bad, but better in the sense of more fully achieving what covenants are for, bringing human beings into genuine, lasting relationship with the living God. Verse 24 gives us a phrase that I find quietly powerful. Jesus holds his priesthood permanently. The Greek word is aparabatos, which means something that cannot be transferred, that cannot be passed on to another, that does not expire or change hands. Every high priest in the Aaronic line eventually died, and his office passed to a successor. The system required ongoing succession because it was built on mortal human beings. The Melchizedek priesthood, as the author understands it, does not work this way. It is held by one who lives permanently. And this, verse 25 says, means he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. That is the pastoral heart of the whole argument. Not abstract priesthood theory, but the living reality of intercession. Someone permanently present, permanently active, on behalf of those who need it. What the author of Hebrews has built in chapter 7 is a complete theological architecture. From the Genesis encounter, through the psalm, through the logic of the tithe and the blessing, through the argument from law and covenant, to the final declaration of a permanent priesthood, grounded in a divine oath that cannot be revoked. It is intricate, careful, and deeply rooted in the texts they shared with their readers. As we close this chapter and prepare to move forward, I want to invite you to simply rest in the shape of what has been constructed here. The argument is done. The case has been made. Melchizedek, that mysterious figure from 3 verses in Genesis, has served as the key that unlocked an entirely new way of understanding priesthood, covenant, and the relationship between God and humanity. In our next chapter, we travel to Alexandria, to a Jewish philosopher who was thinking about Melchizedek at almost exactly the same time, and who saw something entirely different in those 3 ancient verses. I want to take you now to a city that in the ancient world was unlike any other. Alexandria, Egypt. Not the dusty, battle-scarred landscape of the desert wars we have been reading about in Genesis, and not the intimate intensity of a letter written to a struggling community. Alexandria was something else entirely. It was the intellectual capital of the ancient Mediterranean world, in home to the greatest library ever assembled, a place where Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion and Jewish scholarship met and argued and influenced one another in ways that shaped the entire subsequent history of Western thought. And in that city, in the decades around the birth of Jesus, roughly 20 years before the Common Era to about 50 years into it, there lived a Jewish philosopher whose name was Philo. Philo of Alexandria. And Philo had things to say about Melchizedek that are unlike anything we have encountered so far. Philo was a man of extraordinary learning. He knew the Hebrew scriptures with the depth and devotion of a committed Jew, and he knew Greek philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Plato, with the confidence of someone who had been educated in the finest intellectual traditions of his age. His life's work was essentially one grand project, showing that the wisdom of the Torah and the wisdom of Greek philosophy were not contradictory, but complementary, that the God of Abraham and the transcendent principle at the heart of Platonic thought were, at some deep level, pointing toward the same truth. He used a method of reading scripture called allegorical exegesis, looking beneath the surface of the biblical narrative for hidden philosophical meanings. And when he turned that method on the figure of Melchizedek, the results were striking. In his work, Legum Allegoriae, which translates roughly as allegorical interpretation, in the third volume, at sections 79 through 82, Philo engages directly with Melchizedek. And the first thing he does is address the question that the text of Genesis raises so pointedly. Who taught this man? Where did he come from? What tradition formed him? Philo's answer is that Melchizedek is autodidactos, a Greek word meaning self-taught. But Philo does not mean this in a trivial sense, as if Melchizedek simply figured things out on his own through hard study. He means something philosophically significant. Melchizedek's knowledge of God did not come through human instruction, through a school or a tradition or a teacher. It arose from within him through a direct and innate connection to divine wisdom. He is the prototype, in Philo's reading, of the soul that knows God by nature rather than by learning. This idea leads Philo toward one of his most remarkable interpretive moves. In Philo's philosophical framework, the highest principle of reality, the ordering principle of the cosmos, the rational structure that holds all things together, is what he calls the Logos. The Logos is not exactly a person, not quite a god, but the divine mind's own expression of itself in the world. And when Philo reads about Melchizedek, he sees in this mysterious, self-taught priest a figure who embodies, or perhaps represents, the Logos. The David Runier, who studied Philo's relationship to Platonic, thought carefully noted that for Philo, figures like Melchizedek function as living illustrations of philosophical truths. They are not just historical people. They are symbolic embodiments of spiritual realities. In Melchizedek's case, the reality he embodies is the soul's direct, unmediated access to God through divine reason. Now, Philo also turns his philosophical attention to the bread and wine. You will remember from our earlier chapter that Genesis 14, verse 18, records Melchizedek bringing out bread and wine to Abram. The author of Hebrews largely passes over this detail, focusing on the blessing and the tithe. But Philo stops here and looks very carefully. In Legum Allegoriae 3, at section 82, he interprets the bread and wine not as physical food, but as symbols. The bread representing the nourishment of wisdom, the wine representing joy and gladness that come from the knowledge of God. For Philo, everything in Scripture operates on at least two levels: the literal level of the narrative and the deeper allegorical level of spiritual meaning. The bread and wine that Melchizedek offers Abram are, in this reading, the gifts of the philosopher-priest, wisdom and divine joy, offered to a soul that has just won a great inner battle. What I find genuinely interesting about Philo's reading is how different it is from the Qumran community's reading. Even though both were Jewish and both were engaging with the same text at roughly the same period in history. The Qumran community, as we saw in our previous chapter, read Melchizedek as an apocalyptic heavenly judge who would appear at the end of days to deliver the righteous and defeat the forces of evil. Philo reads Melchizedek as a philosophical archetype, the self-taught soul, the embodiment of the Logos, the priest of inner wisdom. One reading is dramatic and cosmic and eschatological. The other is contemplative and philosophical and inward. Both are reading Genesis 14. And both are asking the same questions, and they arrive at entirely different answers. This tells us something important. The figure of Melchizedek was not a single, fixed symbol in the ancient world. He was a space in which different communities could project their deepest theological and philosophical aspirations. I should be careful to note something that matters for how we place Philo in this story. Philo's works were not preserved by the Jewish community after his death. They were preserved largely by early Christian scholars who found his Logos theology useful for developing their own understanding of Christ. Philo himself, of course, was not a Christian. He lived and died as a devoted Jew. His connection between Melchizedek and the Logos was a philosophical Jewish argument, not a Christian one. And yet, when we read the opening of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And when we see the author of Hebrews developing ideas about divine wisdom made flesh, we are in a world where Philo's kind of thinking had clearly been circulating and influencing. The scholar David Runier spent considerable energy mapping this relationship, and while he was careful to avoid claiming direct dependence, the convergence of ideas is unmistakable. What Philo gives us in his treatment of Melchizedek is a reading that is peaceful in its quality, meditative, inward, focused on the life of the soul rather than cosmic battle or legal argument. And I find that quality genuinely beautiful, even if it is not where I would ultimately land on the question of what the Genesis text means. There is something right in Philo's instinct that Melchizedek's self-taught wisdom points toward a kind of knowledge that is not merely acquired, but received. A knowing that comes from being in genuine contact with the divine, rather than simply mastering religious content. Whatever else Melchizedek is, across all the traditions that have reached toward him, he seems to represent something like that. Authentic, direct, unmediated encounter with the Most High God. Philo saw that, and he wrote about it with a grace and precision that still deserves our respect. As we move away from Philo and from Alexandria, I want to carry one image forward with us. Philo saw Melchizedek standing before Abram, offering bread and wine, and read it as a philosopher offering wisdom and joy to a student who had just won a great spiritual battle. It is a quieter image than the cosmic warrior of Qumran, and a more personal one than the divine oath argument of Hebrews. But it adds something to our picture of this mysterious figure, a sense that what Melchizedek offers at its most essential level is nourishment for the interior life. Whatever battles we are fighting, whatever roads we are walking home on, there is something in this ancient encounter that speaks about being met, being fed, being blessed. That instinct, that reading, belongs to Philo, and it is not a bad one to sleep on. In our next chapter, we travel into stranger and darker territory, from the sunlit philosophical rooms of Alexandria to the hidden library found in the desert in 1945. A library where Melchizedek has been transformed into something even more radical than Philo imagined. She's something the mainstream Jewish and Christian traditions would eventually call heresy. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi await us, and they have a portrait of Melchizedek that is unlike anything we have seen so far. In 1945, just 2 years before the young shepherd stumbled upon the Dead Sea Scrolls, something equally remarkable happened in Upper Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi. A group of men, digging for fertilizer in the cliffs along the Nile, struck a large clay storage jar buried in the earth. Inside were 13 leather-bound books, codices, containing texts written in the Coptic language. Those books had been sealed in the ground for approximately 1,600 years, hidden there by someone who clearly wanted them to survive, possibly at a time when possessing them had become dangerous. When scholars finally translated and studied the contents of those codices in the decades following their discovery, they found a library of astonishing variety and strangeness. Texts from the world of Gnostic Christianity, a branch of early religious thought, that the mainstream church had declared heretical and worked to suppress. And among those texts in the Ninth Codex was a badly damaged but genuinely extraordinary document about a figure we have been following with great care. The document is simply titled Melchizedek. I want to approach this text with two things held simultaneously in my hands: genuine scholarly curiosity and careful honesty. The Nag Hammadi Melchizedek text, catalogued by scholars as NHC 9,1, is fragmentary in a serious way. Large portions of it are missing or illegible, and the reconstructions that scholars have proposed, including the foundational work of Birger Pearson, who edited and translated the Nag Hammadi Codex 9, involve a degree of scholarly interpretation and gap-filling that we should acknowledge openly. When I describe what this text says, I am describing what can be read from what survives, with the honest caveat that the picture is incomplete. Think of it as a fresco that has partially crumbled. We can see the figures, we can make out the shapes, but some of the details require careful inference. With that said, what survives is remarkable enough to deserve our full attention. The text is written in Coptic, the late form of the ancient Egyptian language, but scholars like Pearson believe it was likely translated from an earlier Greek original, and that it probably dates to the 3rd century of the Common Era, though it may preserve traditions that are older. It belongs to what scholars classify as Scythian Gnosticism, a branch of Gnostic thought that organized its theology around the biblical figure of Seth, the 3rd son of Adam, as the ancestor of a special line of enlightened humanity. Sethian texts tend to feature elaborate cosmic dramas, heavenly revealer figures, and a sharp distinction between the material world, which they often viewed as a prison or a mistake, and the higher spiritual world of divine light. Into that framework, the author of this Melchizedek text inserted the priest king of Salem, and what they made of him is extraordinary. The Melchizedek of Nag Hammadi Codex 9 is not a historical king-priest blessing a warrior on a dusty road. He is a heavenly figure, a cosmic high priest, who receives divine revelations about the structure of reality and his own role in the great drama of salvation. In the surviving portions of the text, Melchizedek appears to receive a kind of visionary instruction, something like an apocalyptic revelation, in which the nature of the cosmos and his own identity are disclosed to him. The text portrays him as destined to offer himself as a sacrifice, a remarkable parallel to Christian claims about Jesus, and one that scholars believe is probably intentional on the author's part. And in some of the most significant and most debated reconstructed sections of the text, Melchizedek appears to be explicitly identified with Jesus Christ, or at least placed in so close a theological parallel to him that the distinction nearly collapses. I find this aspect of the text genuinely fascinating, and I want to share why. The canonical Christian tradition, the Hebrews argument we spent time with in our previous chapters, uses Melchizedek as a type or pattern pointing toward Jesus. Melchizedek is the foreshadowing. Jesus is the fulfillment. The relationship is directional. Melchizedek first, Jesus after, and Jesus is greater. But in the Gnostic text, that directional relationship becomes blurred, even reversed. Here, Melchizedek is not simply a pattern for Christ. He is a figure of cosmic redemptive power in his own right. Some scholars who have studied the text carefully suggest that the Gnostic author was deliberately pushing back against a reading that subordinated Melchizedek to Christ, and instead asserting Melchizedek's own independent cosmic significance. Whether or not that is the right reading of the surviving fragments, the theological ambition of the text is unmistakable. The document also places Melchizedek in opposition to hostile powers, forces that resist the divine revelation he carries. This is consistent with the Sethian Gnostic worldview, in which the enlightened figure is always threatened by the rulers of the lower world, the cosmic forces of ignorance and darkness who want to suppress divine knowledge. Melchizedek stands against these forces, armed not with a sword, but with revelation, with truth, with the kind of inner knowing that the Gnostics prized above all else. In this, he shares something with Philo's self-taught philosopher-priest. But where Philo's Melchizedek is a figure of serene, contemplative wisdom, the Gnostic Melchizedek is a warrior of a different kind, fighting for the liberation of souls trapped in the material world. Now, the Nag Hammadi codices were hidden in the ground around the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era, roughly the same period when the Council of Nicaea had established Christian orthodoxy, and the process of defining and suppressing heresy was well underway. The books were likely hidden by monks or members of a Gnostic community who knew their texts were under threat. Birger Pearson and other scholars who have studied this period suggest that the monastery of Pachomius, located near Nag Hammadi, may have had some connection to the library's concealment, though this remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What we can say is that someone cared enough about these texts to seal them carefully in a jar and bury them in the cliffs, trusting that the dry Egyptian earth would preserve them. They were right. The earth kept its secret for 16 centuries. What should we make of the Gnostic Melchizedek? I think the honest answer is that we should make of him what he genuinely is, evidence of how powerfully the figure of Melchizedek captured the ancient religious imagination, and how differently different communities responded to that power. The Gnostic text does not give us historical information about who Melchizedek was. It does not give us a more accurate reading of Genesis 14 than the one we have already explored. What it gives us is a window into a world of religious creativity, intense, visionary, theologically bold, in which the ancient priest-king of Salem served as a canvas for some of the most ambitious spiritual speculation of the early centuries of the Common Era. We can appreciate the vision without mistaking it for the canonical text. We can hold it with interest without letting it displace what the more foundational sources actually say. I want to be honest with you about my own response to this text. I find the Gnostic Melchizedek genuinely strange and genuinely interesting in equal measure. Strange because the distance between Genesis 14's quiet, hospitable priest and this cosmic, revelatory figure is enormous. It requires a very specific set of theological assumptions to travel from one to the other. Interesting, because the journey itself tells us something about the depth of hunger that this figure provoked in ancient readers. People were not content to leave Melchizedek as a 3-verse mystery. Across every tradition we have visited, Qumran, Philo, the New Testament, and now the Gnostic library, readers pushed further, asked more, and built more elaborate structures around this ancient figure than the biblical text alone can support. That impulse, that hunger to know more, is a profoundly human one. As we leave Nag Hammadi and the world of Gnostic speculation, we are about to encounter something that shows us the other side of the coin. Not creativity and expansion, but boundary drawing and controversy. Because the very elevation of Melchizedek that we saw in the Qumran texts and in the Gnostic library did not go unnoticed by mainstream early Christianity. Some Christians, it turns out, took the elevation of Melchizedek so far that they placed him above Christ himself. And the result was a formal theological controversy. a movement condemned as heresy, and some of the most fascinating writing of the early church fathers. That is where we go next, into the strange and turbulent world of the Melchizedekians. One of the things I find most telling about any powerful idea is what happens when it is taken to its extreme. We have been following the figure of Melchizedek through canonical scripture, through the philosophical musings of Alexandria, through the apocalyptic visions of the desert community at Qumran, and through the strange depths of Gnostic Christianity. In every case, Melchizedek has been a figure of elevation, someone who grows larger and more significant with each interpretive tradition that touches him. But what happens when that elevation goes so far that it overturns the very theological framework it was meant to support? What happens when the typological figure threatens to surpass the one he was supposed to foreshadow? In the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, something very much like that happened. A group arose, known to history primarily through the writings of those who condemned them, who taught that Melchizedek was not a type of Christ, not a foreshadowing of Christ, but a heavenly power greater than Christ. And the Church, almost unanimously, declared that view a heresy. Our primary sources for this group come from 2 early Christian writers who specialized in cataloging and refuting theological movements they considered dangerous. The first is Hippolytus of Rome, who lived roughly from 170 to 235 of the Common Era, and wrote a work called Refutation of All Heresies. In Book 7, chapter 36 of that work, Hippolytus mentions a Melchizedekian teaching, though I should be transparent with you that the precise details of what he describes and how certain scholars are about specific attributions varies, and this particular reference deserves careful handling. The second and fuller source is Epiphanius of Salamis, a bishop who lived from approximately 315 to 403 of the Common Era, and wrote a remarkable encyclopedic work called the Panarion, a word that means medicine chest, as if his goal were to provide antidotes to theological poisons. In section 55 of the Panarion, Epiphanius describes the Melchizedekians at some length, and what he says is genuinely illuminating. According to Epiphanius, the Melchizedekians taught that Melchizedek was a heavenly power, a divine force of some kind, whose role in the cosmic order was actually superior to that of Christ. Their argument, as Epiphanius presents it, ran something like this: Christ intercedes for human beings before God, offering himself as mediator for humanity. But Melchizedek, they taught, performs an equivalent or superior role for the angels, for heavenly beings. He is, in their framework, the great high priest of the entire created order, heavenly and earthly alike, in a way that places him above the merely human-oriented priesthood of Jesus. If Christ is the priest for human souls, Melchizedek is the priest of the cosmos itself. I find this argument historically fascinating. It is taking the logic of Hebrews 7, which argues for Melchizedek's superiority over the Levitical priesthood, and pushing it one step further to argue for his superiority over Christ himself. Where did this teaching come from? When we look at the building blocks that the Melchizedekians seem to have been working with, we can recognize elements we have already encountered in our study. The Qumran text 11q Melchizedek, with its portrait of Melchizedek as a heavenly judge who presides over divine beings and executes cosmic justice, provides exactly the kind of raw material from which a view of Melchizedek as a cosmic heavenly power could be constructed. The Gnostic text from Nag Hammadi, with its identification of Melchizedek as a figure of salvific power in his own right, points in a similar direction. And the famous verse of Hebrews 7, verse 3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, if read literally rather than typologically, as the author of Hebrews clearly intended it, does seem to describe something more than an ordinary human being. The Melchizedekians appear to have taken that literal reading seriously, combined it with the elevated portrait from apocalyptic and Gnostic traditions, and concluded that Melchizedek was genuinely divine and genuinely supreme. The response of mainstream early Christianity was swift and largely unified. Across the spectrum of what we might call proto-Orthodox theology, major figures lined up to insist that Melchizedek was a human being, a righteous, remarkable, historically significant human being, but a man nonetheless. Origen, who we have already met, explicitly rejected the view that Melchizedek was an angel or a supernatural being, arguing on the basis of careful exegesis that the text of Genesis presents him as a king of an earthly city who served the true God. Ambrose of Milan, Jerome, and John Chrysostom all weighed in similarly. Melchizedek was a flesh and blood priest-king of Canaan, whose significance was typological rather than ontological. He pointed toward Christ. He did not compete with Christ. His greatness was real, but it was the greatness of a human being who stood in the right place at the right time and allowed God to use him as a living prophecy. There is something I think we should take seriously as we examine this controversy, and it is the question of how much of what we know about the Melchizedekians comes filtered through the writings of people who were trying to refute them. This is a genuine methodological issue in the study of early Christian heresy, and scholars like Robert Barkham, who have worked on related topics in this period, have noted it carefully. When Epiphanius describes the Melchizedekians, he is describing them as their opponent, not as their friend or their historian. Heresiological writing that catalogues and condemns heresy, tends to represent the condemned view in the way most useful for refutation, which is not always the most accurate or charitable way. This does not mean Epiphanius is simply wrong, or that the Melchizedekian movement did not exist. It means we should hold the details with appropriate care, recognizing that we are seeing this group through a polemical lens, not through their own self-presentation. What the controversy reveals, even through that filtered lens, is something important about the power of the Melchizedek figure in the early centuries of Christian history. He was not a minor footnote. He was not a curiosity that scholars occasionally mentioned and then moved on from. He was a live question, a figure whose proper interpretation felt urgent enough that communities formed around particular answers, that major theologians spent real energy on refutation, that a council of heresy was convened in his name. When a figure generates that kind of heat, it is because something genuinely significant is at stake. The question of who Melchizedek is, human or divine, type or archetype, foreshadowing or fulfillment, was not an abstract puzzle. It was connected to the most fundamental questions these communities were asking. Who is Christ? What is the nature of his priesthood? How does it relate to the rest of the divine order? Melchizedek stood at the intersection of all those questions, and different communities resolved that intersection in radically different ways. I want to share with you something that I find genuinely moving about this whole episode, even amid the theological conflict. The mainstream response to Melchizedekian theology, insisting on Melchizedek's full humanity, is, in its own way, a deeply respectful position. It says, a human being, a mortal man of flesh and blood, can stand before God as a priest and speak genuine blessing. A human king can carry the name King of Righteousness and deserve it. The mystery of Melchizedek does not require us to elevate him out of the human sphere to make him meaningful. His meaning comes precisely from his humanity, from the fact that he was a man on a road, on an ordinary day in ancient history, who stepped forward with bread and wine and a word from God. The Melchizedekians, in reaching for something more supernatural, she may have actually missed what is most powerful about the figure they were celebrating. The theological controversies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, for all their intensity, were doing important work. They were forcing communities to think carefully about what they actually believed and why, to trace their arguments back to their sources, to distinguish between what the canonical texts actually said and what later traditions had built upon them. And in every case, the figure of Melchizedek was the pressure point, the place where the argument got sharpest and the stakes felt highest. As we move forward into our next chapter, we leave the world of Christian heresiological debate and travel into a very different conversation, one happening among Jewish scholars and rabbis who are asking their own questions about this mysterious priest and finding their own distinctly Jewish answers. The rabbinic tradition has its own Melchizedek, and he is, in some ways, the most surprising of all. There is something I find deeply human about the way the ancient rabbis read their scriptures. They were not content to leave a mystery hanging in the air without reaching toward it, turning it over, asking questions of it, and finding ways to bring it into conversation with everything else they knew. The figure of Melchizedek presented them with exactly the kind of problem that rabbinic thought was built to engage. A man of obvious importance, appearing in the Torah with apparent priestly authority, and yet connected to no recognizable lineage, no known tribe, no identifiable place in the family tree of Israel. For the Gnostics, that mystery was an invitation to cosmic speculation. For the community at Qumran, it was evidence of heavenly origin. But for the rabbis, it was a puzzle to be solved within the framework of Torah itself. And the solution they found is, I think, one of the most creative and theologically elegant moves in the entire history of Melchizedek interpretation. Let me share it with you tonight. The rabbinic tradition we are drawing on here comes from two foundational sources. The first is the Babylonian Talmud, specifically the tractate called Nedarim at page 32, side B. Scholars write this as Nedarim 32b. The Talmud is the great compendium of Jewish legal discussion and theological reflection, compiled and edited over several centuries and reaching something close to its final form around the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, though the traditions within it are often much older. The second source is the Genesis Rabbah, a midrashic commentary on the Book of Genesis. Midrash being the rabbinic practice of close, creative, spiritually engaged reading of Scripture. Specifically, Genesis Rabbah, chapter 43, section 6, engages directly with the Melchizedek passage. Together, these two texts give us the clearest picture of how mainstream Jewish scholarship processed and preserved the memory of this ancient figure. The identification that Nedarim 32b makes is startling at first glance, and then, when you follow the rabbi's reasoning, genuinely elegant. The Talmud identifies Melchizedek as Shem, the son of Noah. Now let me walk you through why this matters so much. Shem was, according to the genealogical tables in Genesis, the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, and through a chain of generations, ultimately an ancestor of Abraham himself. The Jewish historian Louis Ginsberg, whose monumental work Legends of the Jews collected and organized centuries of Jewish interpretive tradition, documents this identification, and shows how widespread it was across rabbinic literature. If Melchizedek is Shem, then the mystery of his genealogy dissolves entirely within the Torah's own framework. He is not a figure from outside the covenant story. He is part of the covenant story's prehistory, a man who predates the specific call of Abraham, but who belongs to the same family tree that will eventually produce the people of Israel. Think about the reasoning behind this identification, because it is careful and deliberate. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. After the flood, as the world was repopulated, Shem's line carried the blessing. Genesis chapter 9, verse 26, records Noah blessing the God of Shem specifically. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Shem was understood in Jewish tradition as the righteous inheritor of Noah's spiritual legacy. He lived, according to the genealogical tables in Genesis 11, to an extraordinarily old age, long enough, the rabbis calculated, to have been alive during the time of Abraham. If Shem was still alive, and if he was the righteous bearer of the priestly tradition that went back through Noah to the earliest relationship between humanity and God, then it makes perfect sense that he would be the one to step forward and bless Abraham. The Torah does not introduce him by his familiar name, because in his capacity as priest of El Elyon, and he carries a different title, Melchizedek, King of Righteousness. Now the Genesis Rabbah at chapter 43, section 6, adds a dimension to this story that is both fascinating and somewhat sobering. The Midrash raises a question about why the priestly calling passed from Melchizedek to Abraham, or more precisely, why Psalm 110, verse 4, declares a priesthood in the order of Melchizedek as something that would belong to a coming Davidic figure rather than to Melchizedek himself. The answer the Midrash offers is striking. It says that Melchizedek lost the priesthood because of the order in which he spoke his blessings in Genesis 14. Look at the text carefully. In verse 19, and he first blesses Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High. And only in verse 20 does he bless God, and blessed be God Most High. The Midrash teaches that a human being should not be blessed before God is blessed. By blessing Abram first, Melchizedek made a liturgical error. He placed the honor of a human being ahead of the honor of the divine. And for that, the tradition of priesthood was transferred to Abraham and his descendants. What strikes me about this midrashic teaching is the combination of seriousness and intimacy it implies. The rabbis were not dismissing Melchizedek. They were treating his actions with a level of precision that shows they regarded him as genuinely important. Important enough that the order of a blessing mattered. Important enough that getting it wrong had lasting consequences. There is also something deeply characteristic of rabbinic theology in this reading. The idea that liturgical correctness is not a minor formality, but a genuine expression of one's relationship with God. How we order our words of blessing, who we honor first and who second, reveals where our ultimate allegiance lies. Melchizedek, in blessing Abram before God, revealed, perhaps without intending to, a subtle displacement of priorities, and the tradition took note. The historian Josephus gives us yet another angle on Melchizedek, one that would have been particularly resonant for his Roman audience. Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews at Book 1, Chapter 10, Section 2, a work composed around 93 to 94 of the Common Era, describes Melchizedek as a potentate among the Canaanites and identifies him specifically as the founder of Jerusalem. He calls the city by its full name and traces its origins to this ancient priest-king. For Josephus, who was writing in the aftermath of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the antiquity and sacred character of Jerusalem mattered enormously. By connecting Melchizedek to the founding of Jerusalem, Josephus was making an argument, partly historical, partly political, about the deep roots of Jewish civilization in that city. Jerusalem was not a recent invention. Its sanctity went back to the dawn of remembered history, to a righteous king who served the Most High God before Abraham ever arrived. The Shem identification and the Jerusalem foundation story together accomplish something important for Jewish tradition. They domesticate Melchizedek. Not in a diminishing sense, they do not make him smaller or less significant, but they bring him inside the house of Israel's story, connect him to known lines and known places, and give him a role that can be understood within the framework of Torah, rather than requiring a departure from it. The rabbis were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a genuinely autonomous priestly figure standing completely outside the covenant tradition, someone whose authority derived from a source entirely separate from the God who called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By identifying Melchizedek as Shem, they preserved his dignity and his priestly standing, while anchoring him firmly to the genealogical and theological world that the Torah had established. This approach to Melchizedek reflects something I find genuinely admirable about the rabbinic tradition as a whole: its commitment to coherence. The rabbis believed that Torah was a unified, divinely given whole, and that apparent contradictions or mysteries within it were invitations to deeper reading, not evidence of confusion. The mystery of Melchizedek was not, for them, a sign that the text had failed to explain something important. It was a sign that they had not yet read carefully enough, prayed attentively enough, thought deeply enough. And so they kept reading, they kept asking, and the answers they found, Shem, the order of blessings, the transfer of priesthood to Abraham, were not arbitrary inventions. They were careful constructions built from available materials, designed to honor both the mystery and the coherence of the text they loved. As we close this chapter and prepare to move forward, I want to hold one thought in the open air between us. Across all the traditions we have visited in this series, the canonical text, the Qumran scrolls, Philo of Alexandria, the Gnostic library, the Melchizedekian controversy, and now the rabbinic tradition, every single community that encountered Melchizedek felt compelled to do something with him. No one was content to simply file him away as an interesting historical footnote. He pressed on people. He demanded interpretation. He refused to stay small. And that fact, the fact that a 3-verse figure in an ancient book could generate this much persistent, earnest, creative thought across 3,000 years and 3 major religious traditions, tells us something profound. In our next chapter, we will take all of that energy, all of those interpretive traditions, and set them alongside what may be the greatest single question that Melchizedek raises. Was he, in any meaningful sense, divine? The debate is ancient, the voices are many, and the answer, if there is one, is more carefully considered than you might expect. There is a question that has been building beneath the surface of everything we have explored together in this series, and tonight I want to bring it fully into the open. We have watched this figure travel across centuries and across traditions, growing larger and more luminous with every community that touched him. We have seen him as a Canaanite king who blessed a weary warrior, as the self-taught philosopher of Alexandria, as a cosmic judge in a desert scroll, as a Gnostic revelatory figure, as the rabbinic identification of a biblical patriarch, and as the key witness in the New Testament's most ambitious theological argument. In each of those settings, a question has hovered just at the edge of the conversation, never quite directly answered. Was Melchizedek simply a remarkable human being? Or was he something more? Was he divine, in some sense, in any sense, in a way that sets him apart from the category of ordinary human life? Tonight, we sit with that question directly, and I want to be honest with you from the beginning. The answer is not as simple as either side of the debate has sometimes claimed. Let us start with the text that has fueled this debate more than any other. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3. We spent time with this verse in an earlier chapter, but I want to return to it now with fresh eyes. The verse describes Melchizedek as being without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. The Greek words apator and amator, without father, without mother, and agenealogetos, without genealogy, are striking and unusual. They are not common words in the New Testament, and when combined with the phrase, without beginning of days or end of life, they create an impression that is genuinely difficult to resolve into simple human biography. The scholar Fred Horton, in his careful book, The Melchizedek Tradition, published by Cambridge University Press in 1976, traced the entire history of how this verse has been read and concluded that the author of Hebrews was making a typological argument, pointing to what the Genesis text does not say, rather than making a claim about Melchizedek's literal supernatural nature. Eric Mason, in his more recent Brill publication, You Are a Priest Forever from 2008, reaches a similar conclusion. But that scholarly consensus carefully arrived at has never entirely silenced the debate. The position that pushes Melchizedek closest to the divine comes from an unexpected direction in church history, from one of its most revered early figures, Justin Martyr, who lived roughly from 100 to 165 of the Common Era, and is one of the earliest Christian philosophers, wrote a work called The Dialogue with Trypho, in which he argued in section 33 that the appearances of God in the Old Testament, what theologians call theophanies, were in fact appearances of the pre-incarnate Christ, the eternal Son of God taking temporary human form before the incarnation. And Justin appears to suggest that the appearance of Melchizedek may belong to that category, that the figure who stepped out from Salem with bread and wine in his hands was not a Canaanite king, but the eternal Logos, the pre-existent Christ, walking the earth in human guise. This is a bold reading. It resolves the mystery of Melchizedek's origin by dissolving it into a much larger mystery, the mystery of Christ's pre-existence. And it has had a long life in Christian interpretive tradition, even though it has never become the dominant position. Standing directly against Justin's reading is the voice of Origen, one of the most intellectually formidable scholars the early church produced, living from approximately 185 to 254 of the Common Era. Origen explicitly and emphatically rejected the idea that Melchizedek was an angel, a heavenly being, or a manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ. In his homilies on Genesis, Origen argued on the basis of careful exegesis that Melchizedek was a human being, a righteous, extraordinary, historically significant human being, but a man of flesh and blood who ruled an earthly city and served the one true God with genuine priestly devotion. For Origen, the greatness of Melchizedek did not require supernatural origin. The wonder was precisely that a mortal human being outside the covenant community of Israel could attain such genuine knowledge of God and such authentic priestly standing. Humanity itself, in Origen's reading, was the miracle. Then there is the dimension of this debate that we encountered earlier in our series, the portrait of Melchizedek that emerges from the Dead Sea Scroll, known as 11Q Melchizedek. Here, as we discussed, Melchizedek is portrayed as a heavenly figure of divine judgment, a being who stands in the divine council, presides over cosmic justice, and executes God's will in the final age of history. Paul Kobelski's careful study of this text, published in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly Monograph series in 1981, shows how the Qumran community drew on Psalm 82, where God stands in the divine assembly and judges among the gods, and applied that imagery to Melchizedek. Whether the Qumran community believed Melchizedek was identical to the angel Michael, or a distinct heavenly being, or something else entirely, is a question that the fragmentary state of the text does not allow us to answer definitively. But the direction of their thought is clear. Melchizedek, for them, was not simply a man. He was a cosmic actor in the drama of salvation. The scholar Eric Mason, whose work You Are a Priest, forever represents one of the most thorough recent studies of the Melchizedek traditions across Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament, makes a point that I find genuinely clarifying. He argues that we need to distinguish between two different kinds of claims that ancient interpreters were making. The first is an ontological claim, a claim about what Melchizedek actually was in his essential nature. Was he human, divine, angelic? The second is a typological or functional claim, a claim about what role Melchizedek plays in the theological argument being constructed. The author of Hebrews, Mason concludes, is making a typological claim, not an ontological one. When Hebrews 7, verse 3 says, Melchizedek is without beginning of days or end of life, it is making a point about the theological significance of the textual silence in Genesis, not a claim that Melchizedek literally had no birthday and never died. The distinction matters enormously, and collapsing it leads to exactly the kind of misreading that generated the Melchizedekian heresy. Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox traditions have all, over the centuries, settled into substantially the same position on this question. And I think it is worth stating clearly what that position is. All three major streams of mainstream Christianity affirm that Melchizedek was a fully human being, a historical Canaanite king who genuinely served the Most High God, whose meeting with Abraham is recorded as a real historical event, and whose significance for Christian theology is typological. He foreshadows and prefigures the eternal priesthood of Christ without himself being divine or supernatural. The Eastern Orthodox tradition honors Melchizedek as a righteous figure and commemorates him in the liturgical calendar. Catholic theology has consistently used him as a typological prefigurement, especially in Eucharistic theology, as we will explore in our next chapter. Protestant scholarship has generally aligned with this same basic reading. Across these traditions, the human dignity of Melchizedek is preserved, and his theological significance is honored without elevating him to divine status. And yet, and I think this and yet deserves to be spoken, the question does not feel entirely closed. There is something in the texture of the Genesis text, in the deliberate silences that the ancient writer maintained, that continues to generate a sense of unresolved mystery. The rabbinic tradition found resolution in the Shem identification. The author of Hebrews found resolution in the typological argument. Justin Martyr found resolution in the Christophany reading. But none of these resolutions has ever quite silenced the question entirely, because the Genesis text itself, in its magnificent brevity, never answers it. We are told who Melchizedek is by his name and his title. We are told what he does and what he says. We are not told what he is in his ultimate nature. And that particular silence, unlike all the others that the ancient interpreters so creatively filled, seems to have been preserved through all the centuries of reading and debating and speculating. It is still there, and I think it is meant to be. What I personally take from this debate, and I offer this as a reflection rather than a conclusion, is that the most honest reading of Melchizedek holds his humanity and his mystery together without forcing either one to dissolve the other. He was a man. He was a remarkable man. He lived in a real city, ruled real people, offered real bread and wine on a real road at the end of a real battle. And he also carried something, a name, a priesthood, a way of standing before God, that the ancient writers clearly found too significant to explain away, too large to reduce to ordinary human biography. The mystery is not a failure of information. It is, I think, a feature. It is the ancient writers telling us, pay attention. Something is happening here that ordinary categories cannot quite contain. In our next chapter, we will see exactly how that instinct has shaped the way Melchizedek has been honored, invoked, and remembered across 3 living traditions. In their liturgies, their art, and their most sacred rituals. I want to invite you to imagine, for a moment, the letter to the Hebrews without Melchizedek. Take him out, remove every reference to him, every argument built on his name, every quotation of Psalm 110 verse 4, and ask yourself what remains of the letter's central theological argument. What you find when you do that imaginative exercise is that the argument collapses, not weakens, collapses. The entire case that Hebrews makes for Jesus as the perfect and permanent high priest depends, at every critical turn, on the figure who stepped out of Salem with bread and wine in the ancient light. Without Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews has no way to claim a priestly office for Jesus, because Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, not Levi, and no one from Judah could serve as priest under the Mosaic law. Without Melchizedek, there is no ancient precedent for a priesthood established by divine oath rather than by genealogy. Without Melchizedek, the better covenant argument loses its foundation. He is not an illustration in the margin of Hebrews. He is the load-bearing wall. Let me take you into the passages where this becomes most clear. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 19 and 20 give us what I think of as the gateway into the full theological argument. The author writes about hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure, and then says that hope enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The imagery here is drawn directly from the Jewish temple, the inner sanctuary, the curtain, the Holy of Holies where the high priest alone could enter, and only on the Day of Atonement. But the author is saying that Jesus has entered a different inner sanctuary, not one made by human hands, not the one that stood in Jerusalem, but the ultimate reality toward which the Jerusalem temple was always pointing. And the credential that authorizes his entry is not Levitical descent. It is the Melchizedek order. He goes where no Aaronic priest could go, by a right that no Aaronic lineage could confer. The scholar Thomas Schreiner, in his commentary on Hebrews published by B&H Academic, points to Hebrews 7, verses 24 and 25, as the pastoral climax of the entire Melchizedek argument. Verse 24 gives us that Greek word we met earlier, aparabatos, translated as permanent or unchangeable. Jesus holds his priesthood permanently, the text says, because he lives permanently. And then verse 25 draws out the practical, pastoral consequence of that permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. The word translated completely in that verse, panteles in the Greek, can also be rendered for all time or to the uttermost. The author is saying something that, when you sit with it quietly, is genuinely stunning. There is never a moment when this intercession is not happening. There is never a shift change in the priesthood, never a Sabbath, never a vacancy. The one who intercedes for you lives permanently, and his intercession is permanent with him. This is where I think the Melchizedek theology of Hebrews moves from intellectual argument to something deeply personal. The people who first received this letter were under real pressure. Social ostracism, the constant pull of familiarity toward the practices of their past, and perhaps, in some cases, genuine physical danger. For them, the question of whether their high priest would still be there tomorrow, next year, in a decade, whether the one they had entrusted themselves to was reliable and permanent, was not an abstract theological question. It was an urgent, lived question. And the author of Hebrews answers it by pointing to Melchizedek's priesthood as a pattern. Here is a priest who, in the Genesis narrative, simply exists without beginning and without end. And that pattern, applied to Jesus, means his priesthood cannot fail, cannot be interrupted, cannot be succeeded by someone else. Peter O'Brien, in his Pillar New Testament commentary on Hebrews, calls this one of the most pastorally significant arguments in the entire letter, precisely because it addresses the real fears of real people with a theologically grounded promise. The problem that Melchizedek solves for the author of Hebrews is both simple and profound, and I want to make sure it is clear, because I think it is easy to miss if you are not familiar with the Jewish legal context. Under the Torah, and the ability to serve as a priest in Israel was strictly defined by tribal lineage. You had to be a descendant of Aaron, of the tribe of Levi. Jesus of Nazareth was descended from David, which placed him in the tribe of Judah, a royal tribe, not a priestly one. In strict Jewish legal terms, Jesus had no right to be called a priest at all. This was not a minor obstacle. It was a fundamental disqualification. The Levitical system was not merely a custom or a preference. It was Torah, divine law, and it was clear. How then could the followers of Jesus claim that he was not just a priest, but the great high priest? The answer was Melchizedek. Not because Melchizedek was an alternative priestly system that Jesus could join, but because Melchizedek demonstrated that a priesthood established by divine decree could precede and transcend the Levitical system entirely. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 14, extends the Melchizedek priesthood argument into the question of sacrifice. And here the implications become even more far-reaching. The author describes Christ entering not a tabernacle made with human hands, but a greater and more perfect one, offering not the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood, and obtaining not temporary, but eternal redemption. The phrase in verse 12, eternal redemption, Ionian litrosis, echoes the eternal priesthood of Psalm 110. The Levitical system required repeated sacrifice. The Day of Atonement came every year. The sacrifices were offered again and again, because no single offering achieved permanent effect. The Melchizedek order priesthood, as the author understands it, operates according to a different logic entirely. One offering one priest, one act that achieves what the repeated offerings could only approximate. Gareth Cockerell, in his NICNT commentary, makes a point about the phrase once for all, the Greek ephipax, that appears in Hebrews 7, verse 27, and again in chapter 9, that I find worth dwelling on. The word ephipax does not simply mean one time. It means once, in a manner that need not and cannot be repeated. It has a finality built into it that is more than numerical. The author is not saying Christ offered one sacrifice as opposed to the Levitical priests' many. He is saying that the sacrifice in the Melchizedek order has a quality of completeness, of enoughness, that the Levitical sacrifices, by their very repetition, demonstrated they could not achieve. This is why the priesthood argument and the sacrifice argument are inseparable in Hebrews. The permanent priest makes the once-for-all offering. The unrepeatable offering requires the permanent priest. They belong to each other, both grounded in the pattern that Melchizedek, in his mysterious, boundary-crossing way, first established. I want to say something here about what I think is the most beautiful dimension of the Hebrews argument, seen in its full shape. The author takes a figure who appears in 3 verses and leaves no genealogy, no birth story, and no death story, a figure who seems to exist outside the normal boundaries of human biography, and uses him to argue for a priesthood that exists outside the normal boundaries of human limitation. The very qualities that made Melchizedek theologically problematic, no beginning, no end, no tribe, no lineage, become the exact qualities that make him the perfect model for what the author wants to claim about the priesthood of Christ. The silence of Genesis is not a gap to be filled. It is a mirror for the eternal. And what strikes me about this interpretive move is not just its cleverness, it is its depth. The author found in Melchizedek's mystery not an obstacle, but a resource. They looked at what was missing and saw it as a map. The Melchizedek argument in Hebrews also quietly but definitively addresses the question of who can approach God and through what means. In the Levitical system, the people of Israel approached God through their priests, and the priests themselves could only approach the Holy of Holies under strictly defined conditions. The system was built on regulated access, graduated holiness, and the constant reality of human unworthiness, requiring constant ritual atonement. The Melchizedek priesthood, as Hebrews presents it, does not eliminate reverence. It eliminates the barrier of exclusion. The eternal priest lives permanently to intercede, and his intercession is available not just to Israelites, but, and this is quietly present in the text, to all who come to God through him. The universality that was already hinted at in Genesis 14, where a Canaanite priest blessed the father of Israel, becomes explicit in the theological vision of Hebrews. As we bring this chapter to a close, I want you to hold the full sweep of what we have covered. The Melchizedek priesthood argument in Hebrews is not simply a clever solution to a legal problem about tribal eligibility. It is a complete theological vision of a priesthood that transcends genealogy, of a sacrifice that transcends repetition, of an intercession that transcends time, of an access to God that transcends the boundaries of one people or one system. All of that theological vision is anchored, unexpectedly, mysteriously, and I think deliberately, in 3 verses about a Canaanite king who brought bread and wine to a weary traveler on an ancient road. In our next chapter, we step back from the theological argument and look at the living legacy this figure has left behind. In the liturgies of the Catholic Mass, in the Orthodox commemorations, in medieval art, in the continuing traditions of multiple faith communities who still invoke his name when they gather to worship. One of the things I have come to believe after spending a great deal of time with ancient religious texts and the communities that cherish them is that the truest measure of a figure's significance is not what scholars write about them in libraries. It is what ordinary people say about them when they gather to pray. And by that measure, the measure of lived worship, of words spoken in sacred spaces, of rituals performed in the presence of the divine, Melchizedek is one of the most enduring figures in the entire history of religion. He has never been a household name in the way that Abraham or Moses or David or Jesus is a household name. He does not have a feast day in most traditions, does not have churches named after him on every corner, does not appear in the popular imagination the way more famous biblical figures do. And yet his name is spoken in some of the oldest and most solemn liturgical prayers that still exist in living traditions today. He is there, quietly, at the altar. He has been there for nearly 2,000 years. The most striking example of this liturgical presence is in the Roman Catholic Mass, specifically in what is called Eucharistic Prayer 1. The Roman Canon, the oldest continuous Eucharistic prayer in Latin Christianity, with roots reaching back at least to the 4th century and possibly earlier. In the middle of that prayer, and after the consecration of the bread and wine, the priest prays these words on behalf of the gathered community, asking God to look with favor on the offerings as he looked with favor on the gifts of Abel the just, the sacrifice of Abraham our patriarch, and, here is the moment, the sacrifice of Melchizedek, your high priest, a holy sacrifice, a spotless victim. Melchizedek is named in the Roman canon, alongside Abel and Abraham, as one of 3 figures whose offerings prefigure and are gathered up into the Eucharistic sacrifice of Christ. Enrico Mazza, whose scholarly work on the Eucharistic prayers of the Roman Rite carefully traces the history and theology of these texts, shows how this invocation is not decorative. It reflects the patristic theology developed from Cyprian of Carthage onward, that understood the bread and wine of Genesis 14 as a genuine foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Cyprian of Carthage, the North African bishop who lived from approximately 200 to 258 of the Common Era, is one of the earliest writers to use Melchizedek's offering as a direct theological argument about the Eucharist. In his epistle 63, a letter addressed to a bishop named Caecilius, Cyprian argues specifically that Melchizedek's offering of bread and wine foreshadows what Christ did at the Last Supper, and that the Eucharistic cup should contain wine mixed with water, following this ancient pattern. He writes with great conviction that the priest follows what the Lord himself did, because Melchizedek was a figure of the sacrifice of Christ. And this letter is one of the earliest and clearest examples of Melchizedek functioning, not just as a theological argument, but as a living liturgical reference point, someone whose ancient action in Genesis directly informs how Christians should worship in the present. The bread and wine on the road outside Salem have been traveling through time ever since, landing on altars across the world. The Eastern Orthodox tradition holds Melchizedek in similar honor, though it expresses that honor in its own characteristic way. In the Orthodox liturgical calendar, Melchizedek is commemorated as a righteous figure, one of the ancestors of Christ honored for their faith and righteousness. Orthodox theology, with its strong emphasis on typology and the unity of the Old and New Testaments, she sees Melchizedek as a vivid example of how God prepared the world for the coming of Christ, through figures who transcended ordinary religious boundaries. The Orthodox reading of Melchizedek tends to emphasize his universality, the fact that he was not an Israelite, that he served El Elyon outside the covenant framework, and that Abraham himself bowed to him, as evidence that the grace of God was never confined to one nation or one lineage. He is, in Orthodox theological imagination, a witness to the universal reach of divine grace. Now I want to tell you about something that takes us away from texts entirely, away from scrolls and epistles and liturgical prayers, and into the world of stone and light. In the great Gothic cathedral of Amiens in northern France, built between approximately 1220 and 1270 of the Common Era, there is a sculptural program on the main portal, the west facade, that includes a carved figure of Melchizedek. He stands in stone, holding what tradition identifies as bread and wine, his priestly and royal character expressed in the medieval artistic conventions of the period. Amiens Cathedral is one of the greatest achievements of Gothic architecture, and its sculptural program was designed to present the whole sweep of salvation history to worshippers arriving at its doors. That Melchizedek was given a place in that program, alongside prophets, apostles, and saints, tells us something important. By the 13th century, this three-verse figure from Genesis had become part of the visual and devotional vocabulary of Western Christianity so thoroughly that his image could stand on the facade of one of France's greatest churches as a figure immediately recognizable and theologically significant to those who passed by. There is another tradition that has built one of its most distinctive institutions around the name of Melchizedek, and I want to address it with the same care and respect I have tried to bring to every tradition in this series. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose members are often called Mormons, organizes its priesthood into two orders. The higher of these is called the Melchizedek priesthood, and its name comes directly from the theological reasoning we have followed through Hebrews 7. The Doctrine and Covenants, a text of Scripture recognized in the Latter-day Saint tradition, addresses this priesthood in section 107, verses 2 through 4, explaining that the higher priesthood is named after Melchizedek because he was such a great high priest, and that before his time it was called the Holy Priesthood after the order of the Son of God. For millions of members of this tradition around the world today, the name Melchizedek is not an ancient academic curiosity. It is the name of the priesthood that authorizes their most sacred religious acts and defines their highest spiritual responsibilities. That is a living legacy that reaches from Genesis 14 directly into the 21st century. What unites all of these diverse expressions, the Roman canon, the Orthodox commemoration, the stone carving at Amiens, the latter-day saint priesthood structure, is a shared intuition that Melchizedek represents something genuinely foundational about the relationship between humanity and the divine. Each tradition has read that something differently, expressed it differently, honored it in its own characteristic way. But the intuition itself is remarkably consistent. This figure, whoever he was, stood at a point where the human and the holy met with unusual directness and clarity. He offered bread and wine. He spoke blessing. He received honor. And in doing those three simple things, he enacted something that every tradition of worship has tried, in its own way, to reenact ever since. There is a thread running from that road outside Salem to every altar, every table, every place where bread is broken and a blessing is spoken in the presence of the sacred. I find it genuinely moving that Melchizedek's legacy in the world of art and liturgy tends to be so quiet and so elemental. He is not usually depicted in dramatic scenes of battle or miraculous intervention. He appears in texts, in stone, in prayer, holding bread and wine, standing, offering, blessing. The visual and liturgical tradition has been faithful to the simplicity of the Genesis account in a way that the theological tradition sometimes has not been. While scholars and theologians were arguing about whether he was human or divine, Levitical or eternal, type or archetype, the artists and liturgists were simply drawing him as a man with bread in his hands, standing at the intersection of the human and the holy, doing what a priest does. I think there is wisdom in that simplicity. Sometimes the most faithful response to a mystery is not to explain it, but to enact it. To lift the bread, speak the blessing, and trust that something ancient and true is present in the gesture. The legacy of Melchizedek in living traditions today is also a reminder that the biblical text is not a closed artifact from the past. It is a living document that continues to generate meaning, to shape communities, to inform worship, to inspire art. Every Sunday that the Roman canon is prayed, his name is spoken. Every time an Orthodox priest commemorates the righteous ancestors of Christ, he is included among them. Every time a Latter-day Saint bishop exercises the Melchizedek priesthood, the ancient figure is invoked in a contemporary act. The 3 verses of Genesis 14 have not been exhausted. They are still producing fruit after 3,000 years, and I suspect they will continue to do so for a very long time to come. As we move toward the final chapter of our series, I want you to feel the fullness of what we have assembled together. We began with a brief encounter on a road in the ancient world, and we have traveled through caves and philosophical schools and theological controversies and Gothic cathedrals and living worship traditions. What we have found at every stopping point along the way is that Melchizedek refuses to become simple. He refuses to be fully explained, fully categorized, fully contained. And perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about him. He is a figure who keeps opening, who keeps pointing somewhere beyond himself, who keeps inviting the communities that encounter him to reach for something larger than they had previously imagined. In our final chapter, we ask the deepest and most personal question of the whole series. Why does this matter? Why does a 3-verse figure from an ancient text still press on us, still move us, still carry this weight? The answer, I think, is more personal than any of the theological arguments we have explored, and it is waiting for us. We have come a long way together. We began on a road outside an ancient city, watching a man with bread and wine step forward to meet a weary warrior. We followed that man through the royal courts of Jerusalem, where a psalmist invoked his name in a divine oath. We followed him into desert caves, where a community of scribes gave him heavenly fire. We followed him to Alexandria, where a philosopher dressed him in the language of the Logos. We followed him to Egypt again, where Gnostic visionaries turned him into a cosmic redeemer. We watched early Christians argue passionately about whether he was human or divine. We heard rabbis identify him with a patriarch from before the flood. We traced him into the greatest theological argument in the New Testament. We found his name on the lips of medieval priests and carved in the stone of Gothic cathedrals and written into the structures of living religious communities today. And now, at the end of all that traveling, I want us to stop, not to summarize, not to conclude, but to ask together the question that has been underneath all of this from the very beginning. Why? Why does a figure mentioned in 3 verses of Genesis endure like this? What is it about Melchizedek that refuses to let go of the human imagination across 30 centuries of history? I want to start with something that the scholars Fred Horton and Eric Mason both observed in their careful studies of the Melchizedek tradition, something that sounds simple but is actually quite profound. Horton, writing in the Melchizedek tradition from Cambridge University Press, noted that Melchizedek is among the most exegetically productive brief texts in the entire world of religious literature. 3 verses. 3 verses that have generated more commentary, more theological argument, more creative interpretation, more community formation, more liturgical expression than passages 10 times their length. Mason, in You Are a Priest Forever, she showed how this productivity spans not just one tradition, but at least 3 major religious traditions: Jewish, Christian, and the broad world of Second Temple and Gnostic texts, each of which found in those 3 verses something it needed, something it could not find anywhere else. The mystery has been, in the most literal sense, generative. It has not just asked questions, it has produced communities. I think part of the answer to why Melchizedek endures lies in the nature of the silences themselves. We have noted throughout this series that the ancient writer of Genesis 14 gave us almost none of the information we would expect about a figure of this apparent importance. No father, no mother, no genealogy, no birth story, no death scene, no tribal affiliation, no origin narrative. And I want to suggest to you that this is not simply a gap. It is a deliberate kind of literary space. Whether the ancient writer created that space intentionally, or whether it was simply the nature of the source material they were working with, the effect is the same. Melchizedek exists in the text without the usual human markers that would anchor him to a particular time, place, family, or community. And that means, and this is what I think is at the heart of his enduring power, every tradition that has encountered him has been free to find in him something of themselves. He is, in a sense, the biblical figure who belongs to everyone, precisely because the text does not tie him exclusively to anyone. The writer of Hebrews understood this dynamic intuitively. When they wrote in chapter 7, verse 3, that Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. They were not simply making a typological argument, though they were certainly doing that. They were also, perhaps unconsciously, naming the very quality of the Genesis text that had made Melchizedek so persistently fascinating. The genealogical silence is what makes him available as a type, not just for Christ, but for the deepest human longing, for a priesthood that does not depend on accident of birth, a blessing that does not depend on the worthiness of the one who receives it, a divine connection that does not require you to belong to the right family or the right tribe or the right system. Melchizedek steps out from Salem to bless Abraham, who is not a Levite, not a priest, and not a member of any established religious order. He just blesses him, because that is what he does. And that simplicity, that unconditioned generosity, is part of why he endures. There is also something in the specific elements of the encounter that carries an extraordinary staying power: bread and wine. I have been thinking about this throughout our series, and I keep coming back to the elemental quality of those 2 things. Not gold, not weapons, not scrolls of law or tablets of covenant, bread and wine, the most basic, most universal, most human of foods. Bread is what keeps you alive. Wine is what makes life feel like something worth celebrating. Melchizedek brings sustenance and joy to a man who has been fighting for survival. And those 2 things, in their material simplicity, in their earthy, physical reality, became the basis for centuries of theological reflection, liturgical practice and artistic expression, the Eucharist, the philosophical allegory of wisdom and divine joy, the cosmic sacrifice. All of it grew from bread and wine on a road. The most ordinary things in the hands of the right person at the right moment become inexhaustibly significant. I want to acknowledge something directly and honestly. We do not know, and may never know, whether there was a historical Melchizedek, a flesh and blood king who ruled a city called Salem and served a god he called El Elyon and met a man named Abram on a road after a battle. No archaeological discovery has confirmed the event. No extra-biblical text names him independently. The names of the 9 kings in Genesis 14 remain unverified in any ancient Near Eastern record. This is not cause for either dismissal or despair. It is simply the honest state of our knowledge. The text of Genesis 14 stands on its own terms, as ancient writers preserved it and as communities of faith have received it. What we can say with certainty is that the figure who lives in those 3 verses has been real in its effects, real in the communities it formed, the liturgies it shaped, the arguments it generated, the art it inspired, the theology it built. Whatever the historical Melchizedek was or was not, the textual Melchizedek has been one of the most consequential figures in the history of religious thought. The scholar Eric Mason, whose work we have returned to throughout this series, she makes an observation near the end of You Are a Priest Forever that I find genuinely moving. He notes that the author of Hebrews, in taking up the Melchizedek tradition, was not simply solving a theological problem. They were doing what every community that touched Melchizedek had done. They were reaching towards something that the existing categories could not quite contain, and finding in this ancient, boundary-crossing figure the language they needed to say it. The Qumran community needed a heavenly judge for their apocalyptic hope. Melchizedek gave them that. Philo needed a philosopher priest who knew God by nature. Melchizedek gave him that. The Gnostics needed a cosmic redeemer beyond the limits of orthodox categories. Melchizedek, in their reading, gave them that. And the author of Hebrews needed a precedent for a priesthood that transcended lineage, that was permanent rather than successive, that was grounded in divine oath rather than human law. Melchizedek gave them that. He has been a figure of meeting, a place where the human need to articulate something inexpressible encounters a text with exactly enough mystery to bear the weight. There is a theological observation that I want to share carefully, because I think it is important and because I think it is easy to miss. Across all the traditions that have reached toward Melchizedek, what they have consistently found in him is a figure who stands at a threshold between the known and the unknown, between the human and the divine, between one religious order and another, between the familiar and the transcendent. He is always, she in every tradition, a liminal figure. The word liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold, the space between 2 rooms, the moment between 2 states of being. Melchizedek, in Genesis, stands at the threshold between the pre-covenant world and the covenant world, blessing the man through whom the covenant will come. Melchizedek, in Hebrews, stands at the threshold between the Levitical order and the eternal priesthood, authorizing the passage from one to the other. Melchizedek, in the Qumran scroll, stands at the threshold between the present age and the age to come. He is always in the doorway, always between, always the figure who makes passage possible. And I think that is why he endures. Because human beings always need someone or something that can stand at the threshold with them. I want to return, as we near the end of our time together, to the quality of the encounter itself, the specific texture of what Genesis 14 records. It is quiet. There is no thunder, no vision, no burning bush, no pillar of cloud. A man comes out of a city. He brings food. He speaks a blessing. He receives a tithe. The encounter lasts perhaps a few minutes on an ancient road, and then it is over. Both men go their separate ways, and the text never tells us if they ever met again. There is no drama in the ordinary sense. There is only the simplest possible gesture of human care. Food offered to someone who is tired, blessings spoken over someone who has done something worthy of recognition, and the fact that the one who offers and the one who speaks is a genuine priest of the Most High God. I find this quality of the encounter deeply instructive. The most theologically consequential moment in the story of Melchizedek is not dramatic. It is intimate. It is ordinary. It is, in its way, domestic. And perhaps that is the deepest reason for his enduring power. He reminds us that the sacred tends to arrive not in thunder, but in bread, not in spectacle, but in blessing, not in the extraordinary, but in the careful, attentive, generous gesture of one human being toward another. As we come to the end of our series together, I want to leave you not with a conclusion about what Melchizedek is, because I do not think the text intends for us to arrive at one. The ancient writers preserved the mystery, and every tradition that has inherited that mystery has added to it rather than resolved it. What I want to leave you with is this: the mystery is not a problem. It is the point. Melchizedek exists in our sacred texts as an invitation to read more carefully, to hold more gently, to remain open to the possibility that the divine moves in the world through figures who do not fit our existing categories, who carry titles we have not assigned, who offer blessings from traditions we did not establish. He was a Canaanite king who knew the Most High God. He was a priest who served before the priesthood was institutionalized. He was a blessing speaker who blessed both the human and the divine in the same breath. And he was generous, generously, quietly, elementally generous, with bread and wine on a road where a tired man was walking home. Let that image be what we carry with us into sleep tonight. Not the cosmic drama of Qumran, not the elaborate architecture of Hebrews, not the philosophical subtleties of Alexandria, though all of those are real and all of them matter. Just this: a road, an evening, the sound of footsteps, a man stepping forward from the city of peace, carrying the most basic gifts that human life requires, and a blessing spoken first over a human being and then over God, that has been traveling through the world ever since, landing wherever bread is broken and gratitude is spoken, and someone who has been fighting finds unexpectedly that they are met. That is Melchizedek. That is why he endures.